Thank you for listening to our audiobooks. We do our best to regularly upload quality books with clear narrations. Please subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell icon so we can bring you more great books. Thank you very much and enjoy your audiobook.
Chapter 38. The shock of Paul Cottrell's death stayed with me for a long time. And in fact, I know I have never quite got over it. Because even now, when the company in the bar of the drovers has changed, and I am one of the few old faces left from 35 years ago, I can still see the jaunty figure on the corner stool and the bushy face peeping from beneath. It was the kind of experience I didn't want repeated in my lifetime. Yet, uncannily, I ran into the same sort of thing almost immediately afterwards. It couldn't have been more than a week after Paul's funeral that Andrew Vine brought his fox terrier to the surgery. I put the little dog on the table and examined each of his eyes carefully in turn. "I'm afraid he's getting worse," I said. Without warning, the man slumped across the table and buried his face in his hands. I put my hand on his shoulder. "What is it, Andrew? What on earth's the matter?" At first he did not answer, but stayed there, huddled grotesquely by the side of the dog as great sobs shook his body. When he spoke at last, it was into his hands and his voice was hoarse and desperate. "I can't stand it. If Digger goes blind, I'll kill myself." I looked down at the bowed head in horrified disbelief. It couldn't be happening again, not so soon after Paul. And yet there were similarities. Andrew was another bachelor in his 30s, and the terrier was his constant companion. He lived in lodgings and appeared to have no worries, though he was a shy, diffident man with a fragile look about his tall, stooping frame and pallid face. He had first consulted me about Digger several months ago. "I call him that because he's dug large holes in the garden ever since his puppy days," he said with a half-smile, looking at me almost apprehensively from large, dark eyes. I laughed. "I hope you haven't brought him to me to cure that, because I've never read anything in the books about it." No, it's about something else. His eyes. And he's had that trouble since he was a pup, too." "Really? Tell me." "Well, when I first got him, he had sort of mattery eyes. But the breeder said that he'd probably just got some irritant in them, and he would soon clear up. And in fact it did. But he's never been quite right. He always seems to have a little discomfort in his eyes." "How do you mean?" "He rubs the side of his face along the carpet and he blinks in bright light." "I see." I pulled the little animal's face round towards me and looked intently at the eyelids. My mind had been busy as he spoke, and I was fairly sure that I would find either entropion, inversion of the eyelids, or ehrlichiosis, an extra row of lashes rubbing against the eyeball, but there was no sign of either. The surface of the cornea, too, looked normal, except, perhaps, that the deeper structure of lens and iris were not as easy to define as usual. I moved over to a cupboard for the ophthalmoscope. "How old is he now?" "About a year." "So he's had this for about 10 months. "Yes, about that. But it varies a lot. Most of the time he seems normal. Then there are days when he goes and lies in his basket with his eyes half closed and you can tell there's something wrong. No pain, really, more like discomfort, as I said." I nodded and hoped I was looking wise, but none of this added up to anything familiar. I switched on the little light on the ophthalmoscope and peered into the depths of that most magical and delicate of all organs, down through the lens to the brilliant tapestry of the retina with its optic papilla and branching blood vessels. I couldn't find a thing wrong. "Does he still dig holes?" I asked. When baffled, I often snatch at straws, and I wondered if the dog was suffering from a soil irritation. Andrew shook his head. "No, very seldom now, and anyway, his bad days are never associated with his digging." "Is that so?" I rubbed my chin. The man was obviously ahead of me with his thinking, and I had an uncomfortable feeling of bewilderment. People were always bringing their dogs in with bad eyes, and there was invariably something to be seen, some cause to be found. "And would you say that this was one of his bad days?" "Well, I thought so this morning, but he seems a bit better now. Still, he's a bit blinky, don't you think?" "Yes. Maybe so. Digger did appear to be reluctant to open his eyes fully to the sunshine streaming through the surgery window, and occasionally he kept them closed for a second or two as though he wasn't very happy. But damn it, nothing gave me the slightest clue. I didn't tell the owner that I hadn't the faintest idea what was wrong with his dog. Such remarks do not inspire confidence. Instead, I took refuge in businesslike activity. "I'm going to give you some lotion," I said briskly. "Put a few drops into his eyes 3 times daily, and let me know how he goes on. It's possible he has some long-standing infection in there." I handed over a bottle of 2% boric acid solution and patted Digger's head. "I hope that will clear things up for you, lad," I said, and the stumpy tail wagged in reply. He was a sharp-looking little animal, attractive and good-natured, and a fine specimen of the smooth-haired breed, with his long head and neck, pointed nose, and beautifully straight limbs. He jumped from the table and leapt excitedly round his master's legs. I laughed. "He's eager to go, like most of my patients." I bent and slapped him playfully on the rump. "My word, doesn't he look fit?" "He is fit," Andrew smiled proudly. "In fact, I often think that apart from those eyes, he's a perfect little physical machine. You should see him out in the field. He can run like a whippet. I bet he can. Keep in touch, will you?" I waved them out of the door and turned to my other work, mercifully unaware that I had just embarked on one of the most frustrating and traumatic cases of my career. After that first time, I took special notice of Digger and his owner. Andrew, a sensitive, likeable man, was a representative for a firm of agricultural chemists, and, like myself, spent most of his time driving around the Derby district. His dog was always with him, and I had been perfunctorily amused by the fact that the little animal was invariably peering intently through the windscreen, his paws either on the dash or balanced on his master's hand as he operated the gear lever. But now that I was personally interested, I could discern the obvious delight which the little animal derived from taking in every detail of his surroundings. He missed nothing in his daily journeys. The road ahead, the houses and people, trees and fields which flashed by the windows, these made up his world. I met him one day when I was exercising Sam up on the high moors which crowned the windy summits of the fells. But this was May. The air was soft, and a week's hot sunshine had dried the green paths which wandered among the heather. I saw Digger dashing like a white streak over the velvet turf, and when he spotted Sam, he darted up to him, set himself teasingly for a moment, then shot back to Andrew, who was standing in a natural circular glade among the harsh brown growth. Here gorse bushes blazed in full yellow glory, and the little dog hurtled round and round the arena, exulting in his health and speed. "That's what I call sheer joy of living," I said. Andrew smiled shyly. "Yes. Isn't he beautiful?" he murmured. "How are the eyes?" I asked. He shrugged. "Sometimes good, sometimes not so good. Much the same as before. But I must say he seems easier whenever I put the drops in." "But he still has days when he looks unhappy." "Yes. I have to say yes. Some days they bother him a lot." Again the frustration welled in me. "Let's walk back to the car," I said. "I might as well have a look at him." I lifted Digger onto the bonnet and examined him again. There wasn't a single abnormality in the eyelids. I had wondered if I had missed something last time, but as the bright sunshine slanted across the eyeballs, I could just discern the faintest cloudiness in the cornea. There was a slight keratitis there, which hadn't been visible before. But why? Why? "He'd better have some stronger lotion." I rummaged in the car boot. "I've got some here. We'll try silver nitrate this time." Andrew brought him in about a week later. The corneal discoloration had gone. Probably the silver nitrate had moved it, but the underlying trouble was unchanged. There was still something sadly wrong, something I couldn't diagnose. That was when I started to get really worried. As the weeks passed, I bombarded those eyes with everything in the book: oxide of mercury chinosal, zinc sulfide, ichthyol, and a host of other things which are now buried in history. I had none of the modern, sophisticated antibiotic and steroid applications, but it would have made no difference if I had. I know that now. The real nightmare started when I saw the first of the pigment cells beginning to invade the cornea. sinister brown specks gathering at the limbus and pushing out dark tendrils into the smooth membrane which was Digger's window on the world. I had seen cells like them before. When they came, they usually stayed. And they were opaque. Over the next month I fought them with my pathetic remedies, but they crept inwards, slowly but inexorably blurring and narrowing Digger's field of vision. Andrew noticed them too, and when he brought the little dog into the surgery, he clasped and unclasped his hands anxiously. "You know, he's seeing less all the time, Mr. Herriot. I can tell. He still looks out of the car window, but he used to bark at all sorts of things he didn't like, other dogs, for instance, and now he just doesn't spot them. He's losing his sight." I felt like screaming or kicking the table, but since that wouldn't have helped, I just looked at him. "It's that brown stuff, isn't it?" he said. "What is it?" "It's called pigmentary keratitis, Andrew. It sometimes happens when the cornea, the front of the eyeball, has been inflamed over a long period, and it is very difficult to treat. I'll do my best." My best wasn't enough. The slow, creeping tide was pitiless, and as the pigment cells were laid down thicker and thicker, the resulting layer was almost black, lowering a dingy curtain between Digger and all the things he had gazed at so eagerly. And all the time I suffered a long, gnawing worry, a helpless wretchedness as I contemplated the inevitable. It was when I examined the eyes 5 months after I had first seen them that Andrew broke down. There was hardly anything to be seen of the original corneal structure now, just a brown-black opacity which left only minute chinks for moments of sight. Blindness was not far away. I patted the man's shoulder again. "Come on, Andrew. Come over here and sit down." I pulled over the single wooden chair in the consulting room. He staggered across the floor and almost collapsed on the seat. He sat there, head in hands, for some time, then raised a tear-stained face to me. His expression was distraught. "I can't bear the thought of it," he gasped. "A friendly little thing like Digger. He loves everybody. What has he ever done to deserve this?" "Nothing, Andrew. It's just one of the sad things which happen. I'm terribly sorry." He rolled his head from side to side. "Oh, God! But it's worse for him. You've seen him in the car. He's so interested in everything. Life wouldn't be worth living for him if he lost his sight. And I don't want to live any more either." "You mustn't talk like that, Andrew," I said. "That's going too far." I hesitated. "Please don't be offended, but you ought to see your doctor." "Oh, I'm always at the doctor," he replied dully. "I'm full of pills right now. He tells me I have a depression." The words were like a mournful knell. Coming so soon after Paul, it sent a wave of panic through me. "How long have you been like this?" "Oh, weeks. I seem to be getting worse." "Have you ever had it before?" "No, never." He wrung his hands and looked at the floor. "The doctor says that if I keep on taking the pills, I'll get over it, but I'm reaching the end of my tether now." "But the doctor is right, Andrew. You've got to stick it, and you'll be as good as new." "I don't believe it," he muttered. "Every day lasts a year. I never enjoy anything, and every morning when I wake up I dread having to face the world again." I didn't know what to say or how to help. "Can I get you a glass of water?" "No. No, thanks." He turned his deathly pale face up to me again, and the dark eyes held a terrible blankness. "What's the use of going on? I know I'm going to be miserable for the rest of my life." I am no psychiatrist, but I knew better than to tell somebody in Andrew's condition to snap out of it. And I had a flash of intuition. "All right," I said, "be miserable for the rest of your life. But while you're about it, you've got to look after this dog." "Look after him? What can I do? He's going blind. There's nothing anybody can do for him now." "You're wrong, Andrew. This is where you start doing things for him. He's going to be lost without your help." "How do you mean?" "Well, you know all those walks you take him? You've got to get him used to the same tracks and paths so that he can trot along on familiar ground without fear. Keep him clear of holes and ditches. He screwed up his face. "Yes, but he won't enjoy the walks any more." "He will," I said. "You'll be surprised." "Oh, but—" "And that nice big lawn at the back of your house where he runs. You'll have to be on the lookout all the time in case there are things left lying around on the grass that he might bump into. And the eye drops. You say they make him more comfortable. Who's going to put 'em in if you don't?" "But, Mr. Herriot, you've seen how he always looks out of the car when he's with me. He'll still look out. Even if he can't see." "Yes." I put my hand on his arm. "You must understand, Andrew, when an animal loses his sight, he doesn't realize what's happening to him. It's a terrible thing, I know, but he doesn't suffer the mental agony of a human being." He stood up and took a long, shuddering breath. "But I'm having the agony. I've been dreading this happening for so long. I haven't been able to sleep for thinking about it. It seems so cruel and unjust for this to strike a helpless animal, a little creature who's never done anybody any harm." He began to wring his hands again and pace about the room. "You're just torturing yourself," I said sharply. "That's part of your trouble. You're using Digger to punish yourself instead of doing something useful." "Oh, but what can I do that will really help? All those things you talked about, they can't give him a happy life." "Oh, but they can. Digger can be happy for years and years if you really work at it. It's up to you." Like a man in a dream, he bent and gathered his dog into his arms and shuffled along the passage to the front door. As he went down the steps into the street, I called out to him. "Keep in touch with your doctor, Andrew. Take your pills regularly, and remember—" I raised my voice to a shout. "Remember, you've got a job to do with that dog." After Paul, I was on a knife edge of apprehension. But this time there was no tragic news to shatter me. Instead, I saw Andrew Vine frequently, sometimes in the town with Digger on the lead, occasionally in his car with the little white head framed always in the windscreen, and most often in the fields by the river, where he seemed to be carrying out my advice by following the good open tracks again and again. It was by the river that I stopped him one day. "How are things going, Andrew?" He looked at me unsmilingly. "Oh, he's finding his way around, not too badly. I keep my eye on him. I always avoid that field over there. There's a lot of boggy places in it." "Good, that's the idea. And how are you yourself?" "Do you really want to know?" "Yes, of course." He tried to smile. "Well, this is one of my good days. I'm just tense and dreadfully unhappy. On my bad days, I'm terror-stricken, despairing, utterly desolate." "I'm sorry, Andrew." He shrugged. "Look, don't think I'm wallowing in self-pity. You asked me. Anyway, I have a system. Every morning I look at myself in the mirror and I say, 'Okay, Vine, here's another bloody awful day coming up, but you're going to do your job and you're going to look after your dog.' That's good, Andrew. And it will all pass. The whole thing will go away and you'll be all right one day." "That's what the doctor says." He gave me a sidelong glance. "But in the meantime," he looked down at his dog. "Come on, Digger." He turned and strode away abruptly with the little dog trotting after him. And there was something in the set of the man's shoulders and the forward thrust of his head which gave me hope. He was a picture of fierce determination. My hopes were fulfilled. Both Andrew and Digger won through. I knew that within months. But the final picture in my mind is of a meeting I had with the two of them about 2 years later. It was on the flat tableland above Darrowby, where I had first seen Digger hurtling joyously among the gorse bushes. He wasn't doing so badly now, running freely over the smooth green turf, sniffing among the herbage, cocking a leg now and then with deep contentment against the dry stone wall which ran along the hillside. Andrew laughed when he saw me. He had put on weight and looked a different person. "Digger knows every inch of this walk," he said. "I think it's just about his favourite spot. You can see how he's enjoying himself." I nodded. "He certainly looks a happy little dog." "Yes, he's happy, all right. He has a good life, and honestly, I often forget that he can't see." He paused. "You were right that day in your surgery. You said this would happen." "Well, that's great, Andrew," I said. "And you're happy too, aren't you? I am, Mr. Herriot. Thank God I am. A shadow crossed his face. When I think how it was then, I can't believe my luck. It was like being in a dark valley, and bit by bit I've climbed out into the sunshine. I can see that. You're as good as new now. He smiled. I'm better than that. Better than I was before. That terrible experience did me good. Remember you said I was torturing myself? I realized I'd spent all my days doing that. I used to take every little mishap of life and beat myself over the head with it. You don't have to tell me, Andrew, I said ruefully. I've always been pretty good at that myself. Well, yes, I suppose a lot of us are, but I became an expert, and see where it got me. It helped so much to have Digger to look after. His face lit up and he pointed over the grass. Just look at that. The little dog had been inspecting an ancient fence, a few rotting planks which were probably part of an old sheepfold, and as we watched, he leapt effortlessly between the spars to the other side. "Marvellous!" I said delightedly. "You'd think there was nothing wrong with him." Andrew turned to me. "Mr. Herriot, when I see a thing like that, it makes me wonder. Can a blind dog do such a thing? Do you think there's a chance he can see just a little?" I hesitated. Maybe he can see a bit through that pigment, but it can't be much. A flicker of light and shade, perhaps. I really don't know. But in any case, he's become so clever in his familiar surroundings that it doesn't make much difference. Yes. Yes. He smiled philosophically. Anyway, we must be on our way. Come on, Digger. He snapped his fingers and set off along a track, which pushed a vivid green finger through the heather, pointing clean and unbroken to the sunny skyline. His dog bounded ahead of him, not just at a trot, but at a gallop. I have made no secret of the fact that I never really knew the cause of Digger's blindness, but in the light of modern developments in eye surgery, I believe it was a condition called keratitis sicca. This was simply not recognized in those early days, and anyway, if I had known, I could have done little about it. The name means dryness of the cornea, and it occurs when the dog is not producing enough tears. At the present time, it is treated by instilling artificial tears, or by an intricate operation whereby the salivary ducts are transferred to the eyes. But even now, despite these things, I have seen that dreaded pigmentation taking over in the end. When I look back on the whole episode, my feeling is of thankfulness. All sorts of things help people to pull out of a depression. Mostly, it is their family, the knowledge that wife and children are dependent on them. Sometimes it is a cause to work for, but in Andrew Vine's case, it was a dog. I often think of the dark valley which closed round him at that time, and I am convinced he came out of it on the end of Digger's lead. Chapter 39. Now that I had done my first solo, I was beginning to appreciate the qualities of my instructor. There was no doubt Flight Officer Woodham was a very good teacher. There was a war on and no time for niceties. He had to get green young men into the air on their own without delay, and he had done it with me. I used to fancy myself as a teacher too, with the boys who came to see practice in Darrowby. I could see myself now, smiling indulgently at one of my pupils. "You don't see this sort of thing in country practice, David," I said. He was one of the young people who occasionally came with me on my rounds. 15 years old, and like all the others, he thought he wanted to be a veterinary surgeon. But at the moment he looked a little bewildered. I really couldn't blame him. It was his first visit, and he had expected to spend a day with me in the rough and tumble of large animal practice in the Yorkshire Dales. And now there was this lady with the poodle, and Emmeline. The lady's progress along the passage to the consulting room had been punctuated by a series of squeaking noises produced by her squeezing a small rubber doll. At each squeak, Lucy advanced a few reluctant steps, until a final pressure lured her onto the table. There she stood, trembling and looking soulfully around her. "She won't go anywhere without Emmeline," the lady explained. "Emmeline? The doll." She held up the rubber toy. Since this trouble started, Lucy has become devoted to her. I see. And what trouble is that? Well, it's been going on for about 2 weeks now. She's so listless and strange, and she hardly eats anything. I reached behind me to the trolley for the thermometer. Right, we'll have a look at her. There's something wrong when a dog won't eat. The temperature was normal. I went over her chest thoroughly with my stethoscope without finding any unusual sounds. The heart thudded steadily in my ears. Careful palpation of the abdomen revealed nothing out of the way. The lady stroked Lucy's curly poll, and the little animal looked up at her with sorrowful, liquid eyes. I'm getting really worried about her. She doesn't want to go walks. In fact, we can't even entice her from the house without Emmeline. Eh? I say she won't take a step outside unless we squeak Emmeline at her, and then they both go out together. Even then she just trails along like an old dog. And she's only 3 after all. You know how lively she is normally. I nodded. I did know. This little poodle was a bundle of energy. I'd seen her racing around the fields down by the river, jumping to enormous heights as she chased the ball. She must be suffering from something pretty severe, but so far I was baffled. And I wished the lady wouldn't keep on about Emmeline and the squeaking. I shot a side glance at David. I had been holding forth to him, telling him how ours was a scientific profession, and that he would have to be really hot at physics, chemistry, and biology to gain entrance to the veterinary school, and it didn't fit in with all this. Maybe I could guide the conversation along more clinical lines. Any more symptoms? I asked. Any cough, constipation, diarrhea? Does she ever cry out in pain? The lady shook her head. No, nothing like that. She just moons around looking at us with such a pitiful expression and searching for Emmeline. Oh dear, there it was again. I cleared my throat. She never vomits at all, especially after a meal. Never. When she does eat a little, she goes straight away to find Emmeline and takes her to her basket. Really? Well, I can't see that that has anything to do with it. Are you sure she isn't lame at times? The lady didn't seem to be listening. And when she gets Emmeline into her basket, she sort of circles around, scratching the blanket as though she was making a bed for the little thing. I gritted my teeth. Would she never stop? Then a light flashed in the darkness. Wait a minute, I said. Did you say making a bed? Yes. She scratches round for ages, then puts Emmeline down. Ah, yes. The next question would settle it. When was she last in season? The little lady tapped a finger against her cheek. Let me see, it was in the middle of May. That would be about 9 weeks ago. There wasn't a mystery any more. Roll her over, please, I said. With Lucy stretched on her back, her eyes regarding the surgery ceiling with deep emotion, I ran my fingers over the mammary glands. They were turgid and swollen. I gently squeezed one of the teats and a bead of milk appeared. She's got false pregnancy, I said. What on earth is that? The lady looked at me, round-eyed. Oh, it's quite common in bitches. They get the idea they are going to have pups, and around the end of the gestation period they start this business. Making a bed for the pups is typical, but some of them actually swell in the abdomen. They do all sorts of peculiar things. My goodness! How extraordinary! The lady began to laugh. Lucy, you silly little thing, worrying us over nothing. She looked at me across the table. How long is she going to be like this? I turned on the hot tap and began to wash my hands. Not for long. I'll give you some tablets for her. If she's not much better in a week, come back for more, but you needn't worry. Even if it takes a little longer, she'll be her old self in the end. I went through to the dispensary, put the tablets in a box and handed them over. The lady thanked me, then turned to her pet, who was sitting on the tiled floor looking dreamily into space. Come along, Lucy, she said, but the poodle took no notice. Lucy, do you hear me? We're going now. She began to walk briskly along the passage, but the little animal merely put her head on one side and appeared to be hearkening to inward music. After a minute, her mistress reappeared and regarded her with some exasperation. Oh, really, you are naughty? I suppose there's only one way. She opened her handbag and produced the rubber toy. Squeak, squeak, went Emmeline, and the poodle raised her eyes with misty adoration. Squeak, squeak! Squeak, squeak! The sound retreated along the passage, and Lucy followed, entranced, until she disappeared round the corner. I turned to David with an apologetic grin. "Right," I said, "we'll get out on the road. I know you want to see some farm practice, and I assure you it's vastly different from what you've seen here." Sitting in the car, I continued. "Mind you, don't get me wrong. I'm not decrying small animal work. In fact, I'd have to admit that it is the most highly skilled branch of the profession, and I personally think that small animal surgery is tremendously demanding. Just don't judge it all by Emmeline. Anyway, we have one doggy visit before we go out into the country." "What's that?" the lad asked. "Well, I've had a call from Mr. Rington to say that his Dalmatian bitch has completely altered her behaviour. In fact, she's acting so strangely that he doesn't want to bring her to the surgery." "What do you think that might be?" I thought for a moment. "It seems a bit silly, but the first thing that comes to my mind is rabies. This is the most dreadful dog disease of all, but thank heavens we've managed to keep it out of this country so far by strict quarantine regulations. But at college it was hammered into us so forcibly that it is always at the back of my mind, even though I don't really expect to see it. But this case of the Dalmatian could be anything. I only hope she hasn't turned savage, because that's the sort of thing that leads to a dog being put down, and I hate that." Mr. Rington's opening remark didn't cheer me. "Tessa's become really fierce lately, Mr. Herriot. Started moping about and growling a few days ago, and frankly I daren't trust her with strangers now. She nailed the postman by the ankle this morning. Most embarrassing." My spirits sank lower. "Actually bit somebody? It's unbelievable. She's such a softy. I've always been able to do anything with her." I know," he muttered. "She's marvellous with children, too. I can't understand it. But come and have a look at her." The Dalmatian was sitting in a corner of the lounge, and she glanced up sulkily as we entered. She was a favourite patient, and I approached her confidently. "Hello, Tessa," I said, and held out my hand. I usually had a tail-lashing, tongue-lolling welcome from this animal, but today she froze into complete immobility, and her lips withdrew silently from her teeth. It wasn't an ordinary snarl. It was as though the upper lip was operated by strings, and there was something unnerving about it. "What's the matter, old girl?" I inquired, and again the gleaming incisors were soundlessly exposed. And as I stared uncomprehendingly, I could see that the eyes were glaring at me with blazing, primitive hatred. Tessa was unrecognizable. "Mr. Herriot," her owner looked at me apprehensively, "I don't think I'd go any nearer if I were you." I withdrew a pace. "Yes, I'm inclined to agree with you. I don't think she'd cooperate if I tried to examine her, but never mind. Tell me about her." "Well, there's nothing really more to tell," Mr. Rington said helplessly. "She's just different, like this." "Appetite good?" "Yes, fine. Eats everything in front of her." "No unusual symptoms at all?" "None, apart from the altered temperament. The family can handle her, but quite frankly I think she'd bite any stranger who came too near." I ran my finger through my hair. "Any change in family circumstances? New baby? Different domestic help? Unusual people coming to the house?" "No, nothing like that. There's been no change. See, I ask because animals sometimes act like this out of jealousy or disapproval." "Sorry," Mr. Rington shrugged his shoulders. "Everything is just as it's always been. Only this morning my wife was wondering if Tessa was still cross with us because we kept her indoors for 3 weeks while she was in season. But that was a long time ago. About 2 months ago." I whipped round and faced. 2 months? "Yes, about that." "Surely not again." I gestured to the owner. "Would you please lift her up so that she's standing on her hind legs?" "Like this?" He put his arms round the Dalmatian's chest and hoisted her till she was in the upright position with her abdomen facing me. And it was as if I knew beforehand, because I felt not the slightest surprise when I saw the twin row of engorged teats. It was unnecessary, but I leant forward, grasped the little nipple, and sent a white jet spurting. "She's bulging with milk," I said. "Milk?" "Yes. She's got false pregnancy. This is one of the more unusual side effects, but I'll give you some tablets and she'll soon be the docile Tessa again." As we got back into the car, I had a good idea what the schoolboy was thinking. He would be wondering where the chemistry, physics, and biology came in. "Sorry about that, David," I said. "I've been telling you all about the constant variety of a vet's life, and the first 2 cases you see are the same condition. But we're going out to the farms now, and as I said, you'll find it very different. I mean, those 2 cases were really psychological things. You don't get that in country practice. It's a bit rough, but it's real and down to earth." As we drove into the farmyard, I saw the farmer carrying a bag of meal over the cobbles. I got out of the car with David. "You've got a pig ill, Mr. Fisher." "Aye, a big sow. She's in here." He led the way into a pen and pointed to a huge white pig lying on her side. "She's been off it for a few days," he said. "Hardly eats out, just picks at her food, and she just lays there all the time. I don't think she's got strength to get to her feet." My thermometer had been in the pig's rectum as he spoke, and I fished it out and read the temperature. It was 102.2, dead normal. I auscultated the chest and palpated the abdomen with growing puzzlement. Nothing wrong. I looked over at the trough nearby. It was filled to the brim with fresh meal and water, untouched, and pigs do love their food. I nudged her thigh with my fist. "Come on, lass, get up," and I followed it with a brisk slap across the rump. A healthy pig would have leapt to her feet, but the sow never moved. I tried not to scratch my head. There was something very funny here. "Has she ever been ill before, Mr. Fisher?" "Nay, never ailed a thing, and she's allus been a real lively pig, too. I can't reckon it up." Nor could I. "What beats me," I said, "is that she doesn't look like a sick animal. She's not trembling or anxious. She's lying there as if she hadn't a care in the world." "Aye, you're right, Mr. Herriot. She's as happy as Larry, but she'll neither move nor eat. It's a rum 'un, isn't it?" It was very rum indeed. I squatted on my heels, watching the big sow. She reached forward and pushed gently with her snout at the straw bedding around her head. Sick pigs never did that. It was a gesture of well-being, and those little grunts which issued from deep in her chest. They were grunts of deep contentment, and there was something familiar about the sound of them. Something lurking at the back of my mind which wouldn't come forward. It was the same with the way the sow eased herself further onto her side, pushing the great stretch of abdomen outwards as though in offering. I had heard and seen it so many times before. The happy sounds and the careful movements, then I remembered. Of course. She was like a sow with a litter, only there was no litter. A wave of disbelief flowed over me. Oh, no, no, please, not a 3rd time. It was dark in the pen, and I couldn't get a clear view of the mammary glands. I turned to the farmer. "Open the door a little, will you, please?" As the sunshine flooded in, everything was obvious. It was mere routine to reach out to the long tumefied udder and squirt the milk against the wall. I straightened up wearily and was about to make my now commonplace announcement when David did it for me. "False pregnancy?" he asked. I nodded dumbly. "What was that?" inquired Mr. Fisher. "Well, your sow has got it into her head that she's pregnant," I said. "Not only that, but she thinks she has given birth to a litter, and she's suckling the imaginary piglets now. You can see it, can't you?" The farmer gave a long, soft whistle. "Aye. Aye. You're right. That's what she's doing. Enjoying it, too." He took off his cap, rubbed the top of his head, and put the cap on again. "Well, there's allus summat new, isn't there?" It wasn't new to David, of course. Old stuff, in fact, and I didn't want to bore him further with a lengthy dissertation. "Nothing to worry about, Mr. Fisher," I said hastily. "Call down to the surgery and I'll give you something to put in her food. She'll soon be back to normal." As I left the pen, the sow gave a deep sigh of utter fulfillment and moved her position with the utmost care to avoid crushing her phantom family. I looked back at her, and I could almost see the long pink row of piglets sucking busily. I shook my head to dispel the vision and went out to the car. I was opening the door when the farmer's wife trotted towards me. "I've just had a phone call from your surgery, Mr. Herriot. They want you to go to Mr. Rogers of East Farm. There's a cow calving." An emergency like this in the middle of a round was usually an irritant, but today the news came as a relief. I had promised this schoolboy some genuine country practice, and I was beginning to feel embarrassed. "Well, David," I said with a light laugh as we drove away, "you must be thinking all my patients are neurotic. But you're going to see a bit of the real thing now. There's nothing airy-fairy about a calving cow. This is where the hard work of our job comes in. It's often pretty tough fighting against a big straining cow, but you must remember the vet only sees the difficult cases, where the calf is laid wrong. The situation of East Farm seemed to add weight to my words. We were bumping up the fellside along a narrow track, which was never meant for motor cars, and I winced as the exhaust grated against the jutting rocks. The farm was perched almost on the edge of the hilltop, and behind it the sparse fields, stolen from the moorland, rolled away to the skyline. The crumbling stonework and broken roof tiles testified to the age of the squat grey house. I pointed to some figures, faintly visible on the massive stone lintel above the front door. "What does that date mean to you, David?" 1666, the Great Fire of London," he replied promptly. "Well done. Strange to think they were building this place in the same year as old London burned down." Mr. Rogers appeared, carrying a steaming bucket and a towel. "She's out in field, Mr. Herriot, but she's a quiet cow and easy to catch." "All right." I followed him through the gate. It was another little annoyance when the farmer didn't have the cow inside for me, but again I felt that if David wanted to be a vet, he ought to know that a lot of our work was carried out in the open, often in the cold and rain. Even now, on this July morning, a cool breeze whipped round my chest and back as I pulled off my shirt. It was never very warm in the high country of the Dales, but I felt at home here. With the cow standing patiently as the farmer held her halter, the bucket perched among the tufts of wiry grass, and only a few stunted, wind-bent trees breaking the harsh sweep of green, it seemed that at last this boy was seeing me in my proper place. I soaped my arms to the shoulders. "Hold the tail, will you, David? This is where I find out what kind of job it's going to be." As I slipped my hand into the cow, it struck me that it would be no bad thing if it was a hard carving. If the lad saw me losing a bit of sweat, it would give him a truer picture of the life in front of him. "Sometimes these jobs take an hour or more," I said, "but you have the reward of delivering a new living creature. Seeing a calf wriggling on the ground at the end of it is the biggest thrill in practice." I reached forward, my mind alive with the possibilities. Posterior? Head back? Breech? But as I groped through the open cervix into the uterus, I felt a growing astonishment. There was nothing there. I withdrew my arm and leant for a moment on the hairy rump. The day's events were taking on a dreamlike quality. Then I looked up at the farmer. "There's no calf in this cow, Mr. Rogers." "Eh?" "She's empty. She's calved already." The farmer gazed around him, scanning the acres of bare grass. "Well, where the hangment is the thing? This cow was messing about last night, and I thought she'd calve, but there was naught to find this morning." His attention was caught by a cry from the right. "Hey, Willie! Just a minute, Willie!" It was Bob Sellers from the next farm. He was leaning over the dry stone wall about 20 yards away. "What's the matter, Bob?" "I thought I'd better tell you. I saw that cow hiding her calf this morning." "Hiding? What you on about?" "I'm not joking nor jesting, Willie. She hid it in yon gutter over there, and every time calf tried to come out, she pushed it back in again." "But, nay, I can't have that. I never heard of such a thing. Have you, Mr. Herriot?" I shook my head, but the whole thing seemed to fit in with the air of fantasy which had begun to pervade the day's work. Bob Sellers began to climb over the wall. "All right, if you won't believe me, I'll show you." He led the way to the far end of the field, where a dry ditch ran along the base of the wall. "There he is!" he said triumphantly. And there, indeed, he was. A tiny red and white calf concealed by the long herbage. He was curled comfortably in his grassy bed, his nose resting on his forelegs. When the little creature saw his mother, he staggered to his feet and clambered shakily up the side of the ditch. But no sooner had he gained the level of the field than the big cow, released now from her halter, lowered her head and gently nudged him back in again. Bob waved his arm. "There you are! She's hiding it, isn't she?" Mr. Rogers said nothing, and I merely shrugged my shoulders, but twice more the calf managed to scramble from the ditch, and twice more his mother returned him firmly with her head. "Well, it takes a bit of believing," the farmer murmured half to himself. She's had 5 calves before this, and we've taken them straight away from her, as we always do. Maybe she just wants to keep this one for herself. I don't know. I don't know." His voice trailed away. Later, as we rattled down the stony track, David turned to me. "Do you think that cow really hid her calf? So that she could keep it for herself?" I stared helplessly through the glass of the windscreen. "Well, anybody would tell you it's impossible, but you saw what happened. I'm like Mr. Rogers. I just don't know." I paused as the car dipped into a deep rut and sent us bobbing about. "But you see some funny things at our job." The schoolboy nodded thoughtfully. "Yes. It seems to me that yours is a funny life altogether." Chapter 40. The doctor put down the folder containing my case history and gave me a friendly smile across the desk. "I'm sorry, Herriot, but you've got to have an operation." His words, though gentle, were like a slap in the face. After flying school, we had been posted at Heaton Park, Manchester, and I heard within 2 days that I had been graded pilot. Everything seemed at last to be going smoothly. "An operation? Are you sure?" "Absolutely, I'm afraid," he said, and he looked like a man who knew his business. He was a wing commander, almost certainly a specialist in civilian life, and I'd been sent to him after a medical inspection by one of the regular doctors. "This old surgical scar they mentioned in your documents," he went on. "You've already had surgery there, haven't you?" "Yes, a few years ago. Well, I'm afraid the thing is opening up again and needs attention." I seemed to have run out of words and could think of only one. When? "Immediately. Within a few days, anyway." I stared at him. "But my flight's going overseas at the end of the week." "Oh, well, that's a pity." He spread his hands and smiled again. "But they'll be going without you. You will be in hospital." I had a sudden feeling of loss, of something coming to an end, and it lingered after I had left the wing commander's office. I realized painfully that the 50 men with whom I had sweated my way through all those new experiences had become my friends. The first breaking in at St. John's Wood in London, the hard training at Scarborough ITW, the toughening course in Shropshire, and the final flying instruction at Wingfield. It had bound us together, and I'd come to think of myself not as one individual, but as part of a group. My mind could hardly accept the fact that I was going to be on my own. The others were sorry too, my own particular chums looking almost bereaved, but they were all too busy to pay me much attention. They were being pushed around all over the place, getting brief and kitted out for their posting, and it was a hectic time for the whole flight. Except me. I sat on my bed in the Nissen hut while the excitement billowed round me. I thought my departure would go unnoticed, but when I got my summons and prepared to leave, I found, tucked in the webbing of my pack, an envelope filled with the precious coupons with which we drew our ration of cigarettes in those days. It seemed that nearly everybody had chipped in, and the final gesture squeezed at my throat as I made my lonely way from the camp. The hospital was at Creedon Hill, near Hereford, and I suppose it is one of the consolations of service life that you can't feel lonely for very long. The beds in the long ward were filled with people like myself, who had been torn from their comrades and were eager to be friendly. In the few days before my operation, we came to know each other pretty well. The young man in the bed on my left spent his time writing excruciating poetry to his girlfriend and insisted on reading it out to me, stanza by stanza. The lad on the right seemed a pensive type. Everybody addressed him as Sammy, but he replied only in grunts. When he found out I was a vet, he leant from the sheets and beckoned to me. "I got fed up with them blokes calling me Sammy," he muttered in a ripe Birmingham accent, "because my name's not Sammy. It's Desmond." "Really? Why do they do it, then?" He leant out further. "That's what I want to talk to you about. You've been a vet. You'll know about these things. It's because of what's wrong with me, why I'm in here." "Well, why are you here? What's your trouble?" He looked around him, then spoke in a confidential whisper. "I got a big ball." "A ball?" "A big ball. One of me balls is a right whopper." "Oh, I see. But I still don't understand." "Well, it's like this," he said. "All the fellas in the ward keep saying the doctor's going to cut it off. Then I'd be like Sammy Hall. I nodded in comprehension. Memories from my college days filtered back. It had been a popular ditty at the parties. My name is Sammy Hall, and I've only got one ball. Oh, nonsense, they're pulling your leg, I said. An enlarged testicle can be all sorts of things. Can you remember what the doctor called it? He screwed up his face. Oh, it's a funny name. Like Vorry or Varry something. Do you mean very cockily? That's it! He threw up an arm. That's the word! Well, you can stop worrying, I said. It's quite a simple little operation, trifling in fact. You mean they won't cut me ball off? Definitely not. Just remove a few surplus blood vessels, that's all, no trouble. He fell back on the pillow and gazed ecstatically at the ceiling. Thanks, mate, he breathed. You've done me a world of good. I'm getting done tomorrow and I've been dreading it. He was like a different person all that day, laughing and joking with everybody. And next morning, when the nurse came to give him his pre-med injection, he turned to me with a last appeal in his eyes. You wouldn't kid me, mate, would you? They're not going to... I held up a hand. I assure you, Desmond, you have nothing to worry about. I give you my word. Again, the beatific smile crept over his face, and it stayed there until the blood wagon, the operating room trolley, pushed by a male orderly, came to collect him. The blood wagon was very busy each morning, and it was customary to raise a cheer as each man was wheeled out. Most of the victims responded with a sleepy wave before the swing doors closed behind them, but when I saw Desmond grinning cheerfully and giving the thumbs-up sign, I felt I had really done something. Next morning, it was my turn. I had my injection at around 8 o'clock, and by the time the trolley appeared, I was pleasantly woozy. They removed my pyjamas and arrayed me in a sort of nightgown with laces at the neck and pulled thick woolen socks over my feet. As the orderly wheeled me away, the inmates of the ward broke into a ragged chorus of encouragement, and I managed the ritual flourish of an arm as I left. It was a cheerless journey along white-tiled corridors until the trolley pushed its way into the anaesthetics room. As I entered, the doors at the far end parted as a doctor came towards me bearing a loaded syringe. I had a chilling glimpse of the operating theatre beyond, with the lights beating on the long table and the masked surgeons waiting. The doctor pushed up my sleeve and swabbed my forearm with surgical spirit. I decided I'd seen enough and closed my eyes, but an exclamation from above me made me open them. "Good God, it's Jim Herriot!" I looked up at the man with the syringe. It was Teddy McQueen. He had been in my class at school, and I hadn't seen him since the day I left. My throat was dry after the injection, but I felt I had to say something. "Hello, Teddy," I croaked. His eyes were wide. "What the hell are you doing here?" "What the hell do you think?" I rasped crossly. "I'm going in there for an operation." "Oh, I know that. I am the anaesthetist here, but I remember you telling me at school that you were going to be a vet." "That's right, I am a vet." "You are?" His face was a picture of amazement. "But what the devil is a vet doing in the RAF?" It was a good question. "Nothing very much, Teddy," I replied. He began to laugh. Obviously, he found the whole situation intriguing. "Well, Jim, I can't get over this." He leant over me and giggled uncontrollably. "Imagine our meeting here after all these years. I think it's an absolute hoot." His whole body began to shake, and he had to dab away the tears from his eyes. Lying there on the blood wagon in my nightie and woolly socks, I didn't find it all that funny, and my numbed brain was searching for a withering riposte when a voice barked from the theatre. "What's keeping you, McQueen? We can't wait all morning." Teddy stopped laughing. "Sorry, Jim," he said, "but your presence is requested within." He pushed the needle into my vein, and my last memory as I drifted away was of his lingering, amused smile. I spent 3 weeks at Credenhill, and towards the end of that time, those of us who were almost fully recovered were allowed out to visit the nearby town of Hereford. This was embarrassing because we were all clad in the regulation suit of hospital blue with white shirt and red tie, and it was obvious from the respectful glances we received that people thought we had been wounded in action. When a veteran of the First World War came up to me and asked, "Where did you get your packet, mate?" I stopped going altogether. I left the RAF hospital with a feeling of gratitude, particularly towards the hard-working, cheerful nurses. They gave us many a tongue-lashing for chattering after lights out or smoking under the blankets, for messing up our beds, but all the time I marvelled at their dedication. I used to lie there and wonder what it was in a girl's character that made her go in for the arduous life of nursing. A concern for people's welfare? A natural, caring instinct? Whatever it was, I was sure a person was born with it. This trait is part of the personalities of some animals, and it was exemplified in Eric Abbott's sheepdog, Judy. I first met Judy when I was treating Eric's bullock for wooden tongue. The bullock was only a young one, and the farmer admitted ruefully that he had neglected it because it was almost a walking skeleton. "Damn," Eric grunted. "He's been running out with that bunch in the far fields, and I must have missed him. I never knew he got to this state." When actinobacillosis affects the tongue, it should be treated right at the start, when the first symptoms of salivation and swelling beneath the jaw appear. Otherwise, the tongue becomes harder and harder till finally it sticks out of the front of the mouth as unyielding as the wood which gives the disease its ancient name. This skinny little creature had reached that state, so that he not only looked pathetic, but also slightly comic, as though he were making a derisive gesture at me. But with a tongue like that, he just couldn't eat and was literally starving to death. He lay quietly as though he didn't care. "There's one thing, Eric," I said. "Giving him an intravenous injection won't be any problem. He hasn't the strength to resist." The great new treatment at that time was sodium iodide into the vein, modern and spectacular. Before that, the farmers used to paint the tongue with tincture of iodine, a tedious procedure which sometimes worked and sometimes didn't. The sodium iodide was a magical improvement and showed results within a few days. I inserted the needle into the jugular and tipped up the bottle of clear fluid. 2 drams of the iodide I used to use, in 8 ounces of distilled water, and it didn't take long to flow in. In fact, the bottle was nearly empty before I noticed Judy. I had been aware of a big dog sitting near me all the time, but as I neared the end of the injection, a black nose moved ever closer till it was almost touching the needle. Then the nose moved along the rubber tube up to the bottle and back again, sniffing with the utmost concentration. When I removed the needle, the nose began a careful inspection of the injection site. Then a tongue appeared and began to lick the bullock's neck methodically. I squatted back on my heels and watched. This was something more than mere curiosity. Everything in the dog's attitude suggested intense interest and concern. "You know, Eric," I said, "I have the impression that this dog isn't just watching me, she's supervising the whole job." The farmer laughed. "You're right there. She's a funny old bitch, is Judy. Sort of a nurse. If there's anything amiss, she's on duty. You can't keep her away." Judy looked up quickly at the sound of her name. She was a handsome animal. Not the usual colour, but a variegated brindle, with waving lines of brown and grey mingling with the normal black and white of the farm collie. Maybe there was a cross somewhere, but the result was very attractive, and the effect was heightened by her bright-eyed, laughing-mouthed friendliness. I reached out and tickled the backs of her ears, and she wagged mightily. Not just her tail, but her entire rear end. "I suppose she's just good-natured." "Oh, aye, she is," the farmer said. "But it's not only that. It sounds daft, but I think Judy feels a sense of responsibility to all the stock on farm." I nodded. "I believe you. Anyway, let's get this beast onto his chest." We got down in the straw and with our hands under the backbone rolled the bullock till he was resting on his sternum. We balanced him there with straw bales on either side, then covered him with a horse rug. In that position he didn't look as moribund as before, but the emaciated head with the useless jutting tongue lolled feebly on his shoulders, and the saliva drooled uncontrolled onto the straw. I wondered if I'd ever see him alive again. Judy, however, didn't appear to share my pessimism. After a thorough, sniffing examination of the rug and bales, she moved to the front, applied an encouraging tongue to the shaggy forehead, then stationed herself comfortably facing the bullock. Very like a night nurse keeping an eye on her patient. "Will she stay there?" I closed the half-doors and took a last look inside. "Aye, nothing'll shift her till he's dead, or better," Eric replied. "She's in her element now." "Well, you never know. She may give him an interest in life, just sitting there. He certainly needs some help. You must keep him alive with milk or gruel till the injection starts to work. If he'll drink it, it'll do him most good, but otherwise you'll have to bottle it into him. But be careful, you can choke a beast that way." A case like this had more than the usual share of the old fascination, because I was using a therapeutic agent which really worked, something that didn't happen too often at that time. So I was eager to get back to see if I had been able to pull that bullock from the brink of death. But I knew that I had to give the drug a chance, and kept away for 5 days. When I walked across the yard to the box, I knew there would be no further doubts. He would either be dead or on the road to recovery. The sound of my steps on the cobbles hadn't gone unnoticed. Judy's head, ears cocked, appeared above the half-door. A little well of triumph brimmed in me. If the nurse was still on duty, then the patient must be alive. And I felt even more certain when the big dog disappeared for a second, then came soaring effortlessly over the door and capered up to me, working her hind end into convolutions of delight. She seemed to be doing her best to tell me all was well. Inside the box, the bullock was still lying down, but he turned to look at me, and I noticed a strand of hay hanging from his mouth. The tongue itself had disappeared behind the lips. "Well, we're winning, aren't we?" Eric Abbott came in from the yard. "Without a doubt," I said. "The tongue's much softer, and I see he's been trying to eat hay." "Aye, can't quite manage it yet, but he's supping the milk and gruel like a good un. He's been up a time or two, but he's very wobbly on his pins." I produced another bottle of sodium iodide and repeated the injection, with Judy's nose again almost touching the needle as she sniffed avidly. Her eyes were focused on the injection site with fierce concentration, and so intent was she on extracting the full savour that she occasionally blew out her nostrils with a sharp blast before recommencing her inspection. When I had finished, she took up her position at the head, and as I prepared to leave, I noticed a voluptuous swaying of her hips which were embedded in the straw. I was a little puzzled until I realized she was wagging in the sitting position. "Well, Judy's happy at the way things are going," I said. The farmer nodded. "Yes, she is. She likes to be in charge. Do you know, she gives every newborn calf a good lick over as soon as it comes into the world. And it's the same whenever one of our cats has kittens. Bit of a midwife too, eh? You could say that. And another funny thing about her, she lives with the livestock in the buildings. She's got a nice warm kennel, but she never bothers with it. Sleeps with the beast in the straw every night." I revisited the bullock a week later, and this time he galloped round the box like a racehorse when I approached him. When I finally trapped him in a corner and caught his nose, I was breathless, but happy. I slipped my fingers into his mouth. The tongue was pliable and almost normal. "One more shot, Eric," I said. "Wooden tongue is the very devil for recurring if you don't get it cleared up thoroughly." I began to unwind the rubber tube. "By the way, I don't see Judy around." "Oh, I reckon she feels he's cured now, and anyway, she has something else on her plate this morning. Can you see her over there?" I looked through the doorway. Judy was stalking importantly across the yard. She had something in her mouth, a yellow, fluffy object. I craned out further. What is she carrying? It's a chicken. A chicken? Aye, there's a brood of them running around just now. They're only a month old, and Towbit seems to think they'd be better off in the stable. She's made a bed for them in there, and she keeps trying to curl herself round them, but the little things won't have it. I watched Judy disappear into the stable. Very soon she came out, trotted after a group of tiny chicks which were pecking happily among the cobbles, and gently scooped one up. Busily she made her way back to the stable, but as she entered, the previous chick reappeared in the doorway and pottered over to rejoin her friends. She was having a frustrating time, but I knew she would keep at it, because that was the way she was. Judy, the nurse dog, was still on duty. Chapter 41. My experience in the RAF hospital made me think. As a veterinary surgeon, I had become used to being on the other end of the knife, and I preferred it that way. As I remembered, I was quite happy that morning a couple of years ago as I poised my knife over a swollen ear. Tristan, one elbow leaning wearily on the table, was holding an anaesthetic mask over the nose of the sleeping dog when Siegfried came into the room. He glanced briefly at the patients. "Ah, yes, that hematoma you were telling me about, James." Then he looked across the table at his brother. "Good God, you're a lovely sight this morning. When did you get in last night?" Tristan raised a pallid countenance. His eyes were bloodshot slits between puffy lids. Oh, I don't quite know. Fairly late, I should think. Fairly late? I got back from a farrowing at 4 o'clock, and you hadn't arrived then. Where the hell were you, anyway? I was at the Licensed Victualler's Ball. Very good do, actually. I bet it was, Siegfried snorted. You don't miss a thing, do you? Dart team dinner, bell ringer's outing, pigeon club dance, and now it's the Licensed Victualler's Ball. If there's a good booze-up going on anywhere, you'll find it. When under fire, Tristan always retained his dignity, and he drew it around him now like a threadbare cloak. As a matter of fact, he said, many of the licensed victuallers are my friends. His brother flushed. I believe you. I should think you're the best bloody customer they've ever had. Tristan made no reply, but began to make a careful check of the flow of oxygen into the ether bottle. And another thing, Siegfried continued. I keep seeing you slinking around with about a dozen different women. And you're supposed to be studying for an exam. Well, that's an exaggeration. The young man gave him a pained look. I admit I enjoy a little female company now and then. Just like yourself. Tristan believed in attack as the best form of defence, and it was a telling blow, because there was a constant stream of attractive girls laying siege to Siegfried at Skeldale House. But the elder brother was only temporarily halted. "Never mind me," he shouted. "I've passed all my exams. I'm talking about you. Didn't I see you with that new barmaid from the Drovers the other night? You dodged rapidly into a shop doorway, but I'm bloody sure it was you." Tristan cleared his throat. It quite possibly was. I have recently become friendly with Lydia. She's a very nice girl. I'm not saying she isn't. What I am saying is that I want to see you indoors at night with your books instead of boozing and chasing women. Is that clear? Quite. The young man inclined his head gracefully and turned down the knob on the anaesthetic machine. His brother regarded him balefully for a few moments, breathing deeply. These remonstrations always took it out of him. Then he turned away quickly and left. Tristan's facade crumbled as soon as the door closed. "Watch the anaesthetic for a minute, Jim," he croaked. He went over to the basin in the corner, filled a measuring jar with cold water, and drank it in a long gulp. Then he soaked some cotton wool under the tap and applied it to his brow. I wish he hadn't come in just then. I'm in no mood for the raised voices and angry words. He reached up to a large bottle of aspirin, swallowed a few, and washed them down with another gargantuan draught. "All right then, Jim," he murmured as he returned to the table and took over the mask again. "Let's go." I bent once more over the sleeping dog. He was a Scottie called Hamish, and his mistress, Miss Westerman, had brought him in 2 days ago. She was a retired schoolteacher, and I always used to think she must have had little trouble in keeping her class in order. The chilly, pale eyes looking straight into mine reminded me that she was as tall as I was, and the square jaw between the muscular shoulders completed a redoubtable presence. "Mr. Herriot," she barked, "I want you to have a look at Hamish. I do hope it's nothing serious, but his ear has become very swollen and painful. They don't get, cancer there, do they?" For a moment, the steady gaze wavered. "Oh, that's most unlikely." I lifted the little animal's chin and looked at the left ear, which was drooping over the side of his face. His whole head, in fact, was askew, as though dragged down by pain. Carefully, I lifted the ear and touched the tense swelling with a forefinger. Hamish looked round at me and whimpered. "Yes, I know, old chap, it's tender, isn't it?" As I turned to Miss Westerman, I almost bumped into the close-cropped iron-grey head, which was hovering close over the little dog. "He's got an oral hematoma," I said. "What on earth is that?" "It's when the little blood vessels between the skin and cartilage of the ear rupture and the blood flows out and causes this acute distension." She patted the jet-black shaggy coat. "But what causes it?" "Canker, usually. Has he been shaking his head lately?" "Yes, now you mention it, he has. Just as though he had got something in his ear and was trying to get rid of it." "Well, that's what bursts the blood vessels. I can see he has a touch of canker, though it isn't common in this breed." She nodded. "I see. And how can you cure it?" Only by an operation, I'm afraid. Oh, dear. She put her hand to her mouth. I'm not keen on that. There's nothing to worry about, I said. It's just a case of letting the blood out and stitching the layers of the ear together. If we don't do this soon, he'll suffer a lot of pain and finish up with a cauliflower ear. And we don't want that, because he's a bonny little chap. I meant it, too. Hamish was a proud, strutting, trim little dog. The Scottish Terrier is an attractive creature, and I often lament that there are so few around in these modern days. After some hesitation, Miss Westerman agreed, and we fixed a date 2 days from then. When she brought him in for the operation, she deposited Hamish in my arms, stroked his head again and again, then looked from Tristan to me, and back again. "You'll take care of him, won't you?" she said, and the jaw jutted and the pale blue eyes stabbed. For a moment I felt like a little boy caught in mischief, and I think my colleague felt the same because he blew out his breath as the lady departed. "By gum, Jim, she's a tough baby," he muttered. "I wouldn't like to get on the wrong side of her." I nodded. "Yes, and she thinks all the world of this dog. So let's make a good job of him." After Siegfried's departure, I lifted the ear, which was now a turgid cone, and made an incision along the inner skin. As the pent-up blood gushed forth, I caught it in an enamel dish. Then I squeezed several big clots through the wound. "No wonder the poor little chap was in pain," I said softly. "He'll feel a lot better when he wakes up." I filled the cavity between skin and cartilage with sulfanilamide, then began to stitch the layers together using a row of buttons. You had to do something like this, or the thing filled up again within a few days. When I first began to operate on oral hematoma, I used to pack the interior with gauze, then bandage the ear to the head. The owners often made little granny hats to try to keep the bandage in place, but a frisky dog usually had it off very soon. The buttons were a far better idea, and kept the layers in close contact, lessening the chance of distortion. By lunchtime, Hamish had come round from the anaesthetic, and though still slightly dopey, he already seemed to be relieved that his bulging ear had been deflated. Miss Westerman had gone away for the day and was due to pick him up in the evening. The little dog, curled in his basket, waited philosophically. At tea-time, Siegfried glanced across the table at his brother. "I'm going off to Broughton for a few hours, Tristan," he said. "I want you to stay in the house and give Miss Westerman her dog when she arrives. I don't know just when she'll come." He scooped out a spoonful of jam. "You can keep an eye on the patient and do a bit of studying, too. It's about time you had a night at home." Tristan nodded. "Right, I'll do that." But I could see he wasn't enthusiastic. When Siegfried had driven away, Tristan rubbed his chin and gazed reflectively through the French windows into the darkening garden. "This is distinctly awkward, Jim." "Why?" "Well, Lydia has tonight off, and I promised to see her." He whistled a few bars under his breath. "It seems a pity to waste the opportunity just when things are building up nicely. I've got a strong feeling that girl fancies me. In fact, she's nearly eating out of my hand." I looked at him wonderingly. "My God, I thought you'd want a bit of peace and quiet, and an early bed after last night." "Not me," he said. "I'm raring to go again." And indeed he looked fresh and fit, eyes sparkling, roses back in his cheeks. "Look, Jim," he went on, "I don't suppose you could stick around with this dog?" I shrugged. "Sorry, Tris, I'm going back to see that cow of Ted Binns, right at the top of the dale. I'll be away for nearly 2 hours. For a few moments he was silent, then he raised a finger. "I think I have the solution. It's quite simple. In fact, it's perfect. I'll bring Lydia in here." "What? Into the house?" "Yes, into this very room. I can put Hamish in his basket by the fire, and Lydia and I can occupy the sofa." "Marvellous. What could be nicer on a cold winter's night? Cheap, too. But, Tris, how about Siegfried's lecture this morning? What if he comes home early and catches the two of you here?" Tristan lit a woodbine and blew out an expansive cloud. "Not a chance. You worry about such tiny things, Jim. He's always late when he goes to Broughton. There's no problem at all." "Well, please yourself," I said, "but I think you're asking for trouble. Anyway, shouldn't you be doing a bit of bacteriology? The exams are getting close." He smiled seraphically through the smoke. "Oh, I'll have a quick read through it all in good time." I couldn't argue with him there. I always had to go over a thing about 6 times before it finally sank in, but with his brain, the quick read would no doubt suffice. I went out on my call. I got back about 8 o'clock, and as I opened the front door, my mind was far from Tristan. Ted Bin's cow wasn't responding to my treatment, and I was beginning to wonder if I was on the right track. When in doubt, I liked to look the subject up, and the books were on the shelves in the sitting room. I hurried along the passage and threw open the door. For a moment, I stood there bewildered, trying to reorientate my thoughts. The sofa was drawn close to the bright fire, the atmosphere was heavy with cigarette smoke and the scent of perfume, but there was nobody to be seen. The most striking feature was the long curtain over the French window. It was wafting slowly downwards, as though some object had just hurtled through it at great speed. I trotted over the carpet and peered out into the dark garden. From somewhere in the gloom I heard a scuffling noise, a thud, and a muffled cry. Then there was a pitter-patter, followed by a shrill yelping. I stood for some time listening. Then, as my eyes grew accustomed to the darkness, I walked down the long path under the high brick wall to the yard at the foot. The yard door was open, as were the big double doors into the back lane, but there was no sign of life. Slowly I retraced my steps to the warm oblong of light at the foot of the tall old house. I was about to close the French window when I heard a stealthy movement and an urgent whisper. "Is that you, Jim?" "Tris, where the hell have you sprung from?" The young man tiptoed past me into the room and looked around him anxiously. "It was you, then, not Siegfried?" "Yes, I've just come in." He flopped on the sofa and sank his head in his hands. "Oh, damn. I was just lying here a few minutes ago with Lydia in my arms, at peace with the world. Everything was wonderful. Then I heard the front door open." "But you knew I was coming back?" "Yes, and I'd given you a shout, but for some reason I thought, God help us, it's Siegfried. It sounded like his step in the passage." "Then what happened?" He churned his hair around with his fingers. "Oh, I panicked. I was whispering lovely things into Lydia's ear, then the next second I grabbed her, threw her off the couch and out of the French window." "I heard a thud." "Yes, that was Lydia falling into the rockery. And then some sort of high-pitched cries." He sighed and closed his eyes. "That was Lydia in the rose bushes. She doesn't know the geography of the place, poor lass." "Gosh, Tris," I said, "I'm really sorry. I shouldn't have burst in on you like that. I was thinking of something else." He rose wearily and put a hand on my shoulder. "It's not your fault, Jim, not your fault. You did warn me." He reached for his cigarettes. "I don't know how I'm going to face that girl again. I just chucked her out into the lane and told her to beat it home with all speed. She must think I'm stone balmy." He gave a hollow groan. I tried to be cheerful. "Oh, you'll get round her again. You'll have a laugh about it later." But he wasn't listening. His eyes, wide with horror, were staring past me. Slowly he raised a trembling finger and pointed towards the fireplace. His mouth worked for a few seconds before he spoke. "Christ, Jim! It's gone!" he gasped. For a moment I thought the shock had deranged him. "Gone? What's gone?" "The bloody dog! He was there when I dashed outside, right there!" I looked down into the empty basket and a cold hand clutched at me. Oh no, he must have got out through the open window. We're in trouble. We rushed into the garden and searched in vain. We went back for torches and searched once more, prowling around the yard and back lane, shouting the little dog's name with diminishing hope. After 10 minutes we trailed back into the brightly lit room and stared at each other. Tristan was the first to voice our thoughts. "What do we tell Miss Westerman when she calls?" I shook my head. My mind fled from the thought of informing that lady that we had lost her dog. Just at that moment the front doorbell pealed in the passage, and Tristan almost leapt in the air. "Oh, God," he quavered. "That'll be her now. Go and see her, Jim. Tell her it was my fault, anything you like, but I daren't face her." I squared my shoulders, marched over the long stretch of tiles, and opened the door. It wasn't Miss Westerman. It was a well-built platinum blonde, and she glared at me angrily. "Where's Tristan?" she rasped in a voice which told me we had more than one tough female to deal with tonight. "Well, he's, Oh, I know he's in there." As she brushed past me, I noticed she had a smear of oil on her cheek, and her hair was sadly disarranged. I followed her into the room, where she stalked up to my friend. "Look at my bloody stockings," she burst out. "They're ruined." Tristan peered nervously at the shapely legs. "Oh, I'm sorry, Lydia. I'll get you another pair. Honestly, love, I will." "You'd better, you bugger," she replied. "And don't love me. I've never been so insulted in me life. What did you think you were playing at?" "It was all a misunderstanding. Let me explain." Tristan advanced on her with a brave attempt at a winning smile, but she backed away. "Keep your distance," she said frigidly. "I've had enough of you for one night." She swept out, and Tristan leant his head against the mantelpiece. "The end of a lovely friendship, Jim." Then he shook himself. "But we've got to find that dog. Come on." I set off in one direction, and he went in the other. It was a moonless night of impenetrable darkness, and we were looking for a jet-black dog. I think we both knew it was hopeless, but we had to try. In a little town like Darrowby, you are soon out on the country road where there are no lights, and as I stumbled around, peering vainly over invisible fields, the utter pointlessness of the activity became more and more obvious. Occasionally I came within Tristan's orbit and heard his despairing cries echoing over the empty landscape. "Hamish! Hamish! Hamish!" After half an hour we met at Scaledale House. Tristan faced me, and as I shook my head he seemed to shrink within himself. His chest heaved as he fought for breath. Obviously he had been running while I had been walking, and I suppose that was natural enough. We were both in an awkward situation, but the final, devastating blow would inevitably fall on him. "Well, we'd better get out on the road again," he gasped, and as he spoke, the front doorbell rang again. The colour drained rapidly from his face, and he clutched my arm. "That must be Miss Westerman this time. God almighty, she's coming in." Rapid footsteps sounded in the passage, and the sitting-room door opened. But it wasn't Miss Westerman. It was Lydia again. She strode over to the sofa, reached underneath, and extracted her handbag. She didn't say anything, but merely shrivelled Tristan with a sidelong glance before leaving. "What a night!" he moaned, putting a hand to his forehead. "I can't stand much more of this." Over the next hour we made innumerable sorties, but we couldn't find Hamish, and nobody else seemed to have seen him. I came in to find Tristan collapsed in an armchair. His mouth hung open, and he showed every sign of advanced exhaustion. I shook my head, and he shook his. Then I heard the telephone. I lifted the receiver, listened for a minute, and turned to the young man. "I've got to go out, Tristan. Mr. Drew's old pony has colic again." He reached out a hand from the depth of his chair. "You're not going to leave me, Jim?" "Sorry, I must. But I won't be long. It's only a mile away." "But what if Miss Westerman comes?" I shrugged. "You'll just have to apologise. Hamish is bound to turn up, maybe in the morning." "You make it sound easy." He ran a hand inside his collar. "And another thing. How about Siegfried? What if he arrives and asks about the dog? What do I tell him?" "Oh, I shouldn't worry about that," I replied airily. "Just say you were too busy on the sofa with the drover's barmaid to bother about such things. He'll understand." But my attempt at jocularity fell flat. The young man fixed me with a cold eye and ignited a quivering woodbine. "I believe I've told you this before, Jim, but there's a nasty, cruel streak in you." Mr. Drew's pony had almost recovered when I got there, but I gave it a mild sedative injection before turning for home. On the way back, a thought struck me, and I took a road round the edge of the town to the row of modern bungalows where Miss Westerman lived. I parked the car and walked up the path of number 10. And there was Hamish in the porch, coiled up comfortably on the mat, looking up at me with mild surprise as I hovered over him. "Come on, lad," I said. "You've got more sense than we had. Why didn't we think of this before?" I deposited him on the passenger seat, and as I drove away he hoisted his paws onto the dash and gazed out interestedly at the road unfolding in the headlights. Truly a phlegmatic little hound. Outside Scaledale House I tucked him under my arm and was about to turn the handle of the front door when I paused. Tristan had notched up a long succession of successful pranks against me, fake telephone calls, the ghost in my bedroom, and many others, and, in fact, good friends as we were, he never neglected a chance to take the mickey out of me. In this situation, with the positions reversed, he would be merciless. I put my finger on the bell and leant on it for several long seconds. For some time there was neither sound nor movement from within. and I pictured the cowering figure mustering his courage before marching to his doom. Then the light came on in the passage, and as I peered expectantly through the glass, a nose appeared round the far corner, followed very gingerly by a wary eye. By degrees the full face inched into view, and when Tristan recognized my grinning countenance, he unleashed a cry of rage and bounded along the passage with upraised fist. I really think that in his distraught state he would have attacked me, but the sight of Hamish banished all else. He grabbed the hairy creature and began to fondle him. "Good little dog, good little dog," he crooned as he trotted through to the sitting-room. "What a beautiful thing you are!" He laid him lovingly in the basket, and Hamish, after a "Hey-ho, here we go again," glance around him, put his head along his side, and promptly went to sleep. Tristan fell limply into the armchair and gazed at me with glazed eyes. "Well, we're saved, Jim," he whispered. "But I'll never be the same after tonight. I've run bloody miles, and I've nearly lost my voice with shouting. I tell you, I'm about knackered." I too was vastly relieved, and the nearness of catastrophe was brought home to us when Miss Westerman arrived within 10 minutes. "Oh, my darling!" she cried as Hamish leapt at her, mouth open, short tail wagging furiously. "I've been so worried about you all day." She looked tentatively at the ear with its rows of buttons. "Oh, it looks a lot better without that horrid swelling, and what a neat job you have made. Thank you, Mr. Herriot, and thank you too, young man." Tristan, who had staggered to his feet, bowed slightly as I showed the lady out. "Bring him back in 6 weeks to have the stitches out," I called to her as she left. Then I rushed back into the room. "Siegfried's just pulled up outside. You better look as if you've been working." He rushed to the bookshelves, pulled down Geiger and Davis's Bacteriology and a notebook, and dived into a chair. When his brother came in, he was utterly engrossed. Siegfried moved over to the fire and warmed his hands. He looked pink and mellow. "I've just been speaking to Miss Westerman," he said. "She's really pleased. Well done, both of you." "Thank you," I said, but Tristan was too busy to reply, scanning the pages anxiously and scribbling repeatedly in the notebook. Siegfried walked behind the young man's chair and looked down at the open volume. "Ah, yes. Clostridium septique," he murmured, smiling indulgently. "That's a good one to study. Keeps coming up in exams." He rested a hand briefly on his brother's shoulder. "I'm glad to see you at work. You've been raking about too much lately, and it's getting you down. A night at your books will have been good for you." He yawned, stretched, and made for the door. "Well, I'm off to bed. I'm rather sleepy." He paused with his hand on the door. "You know, Tristan, I quite envy you. There's nothing like a nice, restful evening at home." Chapter 42. When I was discharged from hospital, I expected to be posted straight overseas, and I wondered if I would be able to catch up with my old flight and my friends. However, I learnt with surprise that I had to go to a convalescent home for a fortnight before any further action could be taken. This was in Puddleston, near Learminster, a lovely mansion house in acres of beautiful gardens. It was presided over by a delightful old matron with whom we fortunate airmen played sedate games of croquet or walked in the cool woods. It was easy to imagine that there was no such thing as a war. 2 weeks of this treatment left me feeling revitalized. It wouldn't be long, I felt, before I was back on the job. From Puddlestone it was back to Manchester, and Heaton Park again, and this time it was strange to think that in all the great sprawl of huts and the crowding thousands of men in blue, there wasn't a soul who knew me. Except, of course, the wing commander, who had sent me to hospital in the first place. I had an interview with him on my arrival, and he came straight to the point. "Herriot," he said, "I'm afraid you can't fly anymore." "But I've had the operation. I'm a lot better." "I know that, but you can no longer be classed as 100% fit. You have been officially downgraded, and I'm sure you realize that pilots have to be grade 1. "Yes, of course." He glanced at the file in his hand. "I see you are a veterinary surgeon. This poses a problem. Normally, when an aircrew man is grounded, he remusters on the ground staff, but yours is a reserved occupation. You really can't serve in any capacity but aircrew." Yes. We'll have to see." It was all very impersonal and businesslike. Those few words coming from a man like him left no room for argument. And they obliterated at a stroke every picture I had ever had of my future in the RAF. I was fairly certain that if my flying days were over, I would be discharged from the service. And as I left the wing commander's office and walked slowly back to my hut at the other end of the park, I pondered on my contribution to the war effort. I hadn't fired a shot in anger. I had peeled mountains of potatoes, washed countless dishes, shoveled coke, mucked out pigs, marched for miles, drilled interminably, finally and magically learnt to fly, and now it was all for nothing. I passed the big dining hall, and the RAF march blared out at me from the loudspeakers. The familiar sound reminded me of so many experiences, so many friends, and suddenly I felt intensely lonely and cut off. It was a new sensation for me, and there, in those unlikely surroundings, I began to think of old Mr. Potts from my veterinary days. He must have felt like that. "How are you, Mr. Herriot?" Ordinary words, but the eagerness, almost desperation in the old man's voice made them urgent and meaningful. I saw him nearly every day. In my unpredictable life, it was difficult to do anything regularly, but I did like a stroll by the river before lunch, and so did my beagle Sam. That was when we met Mr. Potts and Nip, his elderly sheepdog. They seemed to have the same habits as we did. His house backed onto the riverside fields, and he spent a lot of time just walking around with his dog. Many retired farmers kept a bit of land and a few stock, to occupy their minds and ease the transition from their arduous existence to day-long leisure. But Mr. Potts had bought a little bungalow with a scrap of garden, and it was obvious that time dragged. Probably his health had dictated this. As he faced me, he leant on his stick, and his bluish cheeks rose and fell with his breathing. He was a hard case if ever I saw one. "Well, I'm fine, Mr. Potts," I replied. "And how are things with you?" "Nobbut middling, lad. I'll soon get short of wind." He coughed a couple of times, then asked the inevitable question. "And what have you been doing this morning?" That was when his eyes grew intent and wide. He really wanted to know. I thought for a moment. Well now, let's see. I always tried to give him a detailed answer because I knew it meant a lot to him and brought back the life he missed so much. "I've done a couple of cleansings, seen a lame bullock, treated 2 cows with mastitis and another with milk fever." He nodded eagerly at every word. "By God," he exclaimed, "it's a beggar, that milk fever. When I were a lad, good cows used to die like flies with it. All us good milkers after their 3rd or 4th calf couldn't get to their feet, and we used to dose them with all sorts. But they died, every one of them." "Yes," I said, "it must have been heartbreaking in those days." "But then," he smiled delightedly, digging a forefinger into my chest, "then we started blowing up their udders with a bicycle pump. And you know, they jumped up and walked away. Like magic it were." His eyes sparkled at the memory. "I know, Mr. Potts, I've blown up a few myself, only I didn't use a bicycle pump. I had a special little inflation apparatus." That black box, with its shining cylinders and filter, is now in my personal museum, and it is the best place for it. It had got me out of some difficult situations, but in the background there had always been the gnawing dread of transmitting tuberculosis. I had heard of it happening, and was glad that calcium borogluconate had arrived. As we spoke, Sam and Nip played on the grass beside us. I watched as the beagle frisked around the old animal while Nip pawed at him stiff-jointedly, his tail waving with pleasure. You could see that he enjoyed these meetings as much as his master, and for a brief time the years fell away from him as he rolled on his back with Sam astride him, nibbling gently at his chest. I walked with the old farmer as far as the little wooden bridge. Then I had to turn for home. I watched the two of them pottering slowly over the narrow strip of timber to the other side of the river. Sam and I had our work pressing, but they had nothing else to do. I used to see Mr. Potts at other times too, wandering aimlessly among the stalls on market days, or standing on the fringe of the group of farmers who always gathered in front of the Drovers' Arms to meet cattle dealers, cow-feed merchants, or just to talk business among themselves. Or I saw him at the auction mart, leaning on his stick, listening to the rapid-fire chanting of the auctioneer, watching listlessly as the beasts were bought and sold. And all the time I knew there was an emptiness in him, because there were none of his cattle in the stalls, none of his sheep in the long rows of pens. He was out of it all, old and done. I saw him the day before he died. It was in the usual place, and I was standing at the river's edge watching a heron rising from a rush-lined island and flapping lazily away over the fields. The old man stopped as he came abreast of me, and the two dogs began their friendly wrestling. "Well now, Mr. Herriot." He paused and bowed his head over the stick which he had dug into the grass of his farm for half a century. "What have you been doing today?" Perhaps his cheeks were a deeper shade of blue, and the breath whistled through his pursed lips as he exhaled, but I can't recall that he looked any worse than usual. "I'll tell you, Mr. Potts," I said. "I'm feeling a bit weary. I ran into a real snorter of a foaling this morning. Took me over 2 hours and I ache all over." "Foaling, eh? Foal will be laid wrong, I reckon." "Yes, crossways on, and I had a struggle to turn it." "By God, yes. It's hard work, is that?" He smiled reminiscently. "Dost thou remember that Clydeside mare you foaled at my place? Must have been one of your first jobs when you came to Derby." "Of course I do," I replied. And I remembered, too, how kind the old man had been. Seeing I was young and green and unsure of myself, he had taken pains, in his quiet way, to put me at my ease and give me confidence. "Yes," I went on. "It was late on a Sunday night, and we had a right tussle with it. There was just the two of us, but we managed, didn't we?" He squared his shoulders, and for a moment his eyes looked past me at something I couldn't see. "Aye, that's right. We made a job of her, you and me. I could push and pull a bit then." "You certainly could. There's no doubt about that." He sucked the air in with difficulty and blew it out again with that peculiar pursing of the lips. Then he turned to me with a strange dignity. "They were good days, Mr. Herriot, weren't they?" "They were, Mr. Potts. They were indeed." "Aye. Aye." He nodded slowly. "I've had a lot of them days. Hard, but good." He looked down at his dog. "And old Nip shared 'em with me, didn't you, lad?" His words took me back to the very first time I had seen Mr. Potts. He was perched on a stool, milking one of his few cows, his cloth-capped head thrusting into the hairy flank, and as he pulled at the teats, old Nip dropped a stone on the toe of his boot. The farmer reached down, lifted the stone between 2 fingers, and flicked it out through the open door into the yard. Nip scurried delightedly after it, and was back within seconds, dropping the stone on the boot and panting hopefully. He wasn't disappointed. His master repeated the throw automatically, as if it was something he did all the time. And as I watched it happening again and again, I realized that this was a daily ritual between the two. I had a piercing impression of infinite patience and devotion. "Right then, Mr. Herriot, we'll be off," Mr. Potts said, jerking me back to the present. "Come on, Nip." He waved his stick, and I watched him till a low-hanging willow branch hid man and dog from my sight. That was the last time I saw him. Next day, the man at the petrol pumps mumbled casually, "See old Mr. Potts got his time in, eh?" And that was it. There was no excitement, and only a handful of his old friends turned up at the funeral. For me, it was a stab of sorrow. Another familiar face gone. And I should miss him as my busy life went on. I knew our daily conversations had cheered him, but I felt, with a sad finality, that there was nothing else I could do for Mr. Potts. It was about a fortnight later, and as I opened the gate to let Sam into the riverside fields, I glanced at my watch. 12:30. Plenty of time for our pre-lunch walk, and the long stretch of green was empty. Then I noticed a single dog away on the left. It was Nip. And as I watched, he got up, took a few indeterminate steps over the grass, then turned and sat down again at the gate of his back garden. Instead of taking my usual route, I cut along behind the houses till I reached the old dog. He had been looking around him aimlessly, but when we came up to him, he seemed to come to life, sniffing Sam over and wagging his tail at me. On the other side of the gate, Mrs. Potts was doing a bit of weeding, bending painfully as she plied her trowel. "How are you, Mrs. Potts?" I asked. With an effort, she straightened up. "Oh, not too bad, thank you, Mr. Herriot." She came over and leant on the gate. "I see you're looking at our dog. My word, he's missing his master." I didn't say anything, and she went on. "He's eating all right, and I give him plenty of good food, but what I can't do is take him for walks." She rubbed her back. "I'm plagued with rheumatics, Mr. Herriot, and it takes me all my time to get round the house and garden." "I can understand that," I said. "And I don't suppose he'll walk by himself." "Nay, he won't. There's the path he went along every day." She pointed to the winding strip of beaten earth among the grass. "But he won't go more than a few yards." "Oh, well, dogs like a bit of company just the same as we do." I bent and ran my hand over the old animal's head and ears. "How would you like to come with us, Nip?" I set off along the path, and he followed unhesitatingly, trotting alongside Sam with swinging tail. "Hey, look!" the old lady cried. "Isn't that grand to see?" I followed his usual route down to the river, where the water ran dark and silent under the branches of the gnarled willows. Then we went over the bridge, and in front of us the river widened into pebbly shallows and murmured and chattered among the stones. It was peaceful down there, with only the endless water sound and the piping of birds in my ears, and the long curtain of leaves parting here and there to give glimpses of the green flanks of the fells. I watched the two dogs frisking ahead of me, and the decision came to me quite naturally. I would do this regularly. From that day I altered my route and went along behind the houses first. Nip was happy again. Sam loved the whole idea. And for me there was a strange comfort in the knowledge that there was still something I could do for Mr. Potts. Chapter 43. I looked around me at the heap of boots, the piled mounds of shirts, the rows of empty shelves and pigeonholes. I was employed in the stores at Heaton Park, living proof that the RAF was finding me something of a problem. The big war machine was rumbling along pretty smoothly by this time, turning out pilots, navigators, air gunners in a steady stream, and slotting them into different jobs if they failed to make the grade. It ticked over like a well-oiled engine as long as nothing disturbed the rhythm. I was like a speck of sand in the works, and I could tell from various interviews that I had caused the administrators a certain amount of puzzlement. I don't suppose Mr. Churchill was losing any sleep over me, but since I wasn't allowed to fly and was ineligible for the ground staff, I was obviously a bit of a nuisance. Nobody seemed to have come across a grounded vet before. Of course, it was inevitable that I would be sent back to my practice, but I could see that it was going to take some time for the RAF to regurgitate me into civil life. Apparently, I had to go through the motions even though some of them were meaningless. One of the interviews was with 3 officers. They were very nice, and they sat behind a table beaming, friendly, reassuring. Their task, apparently, was to find out what ground staff job might suit me. I think they were probably psychologists, and they asked me all kinds of questions, nodding and smiling kindly all the time. "Well now, Herriot," the middle officer said, "we are going to put you through a series of aptitude tests. It will last 2 days, starting tomorrow, and by the end of it I think we'll know all about you." He laughed. "It's nothing to worry about. You might rather enjoy it." I did enjoy it, in fact. I filled up great long sheets with my answers. I drew diagrams, fitted odd-shaped pieces of wood into holes. It was fun. I had to wait another 2 days before I was called before the tribunal again. The three were, if anything, more charming than before, and I seemed to sense an air of subdued excitement about them this time. They were all smiling broadly as the middle one spoke. "Herriot, we have really found out something about you," he said. "You have?" "Yes, indeed. We have found that you have an outstanding mechanical aptitude." I stared at him. This was a facer. Because if ever there was a mechanical idiot, that man is J. Herriot. I have a loathing for engines, wheels, pistons, cylinders, cogs. I can't mend anything, and if a garage mechanic tries to explain something to me, I just can't take it in. I told the officers this, and the three smiles became rather fixed. "But surely," said the one on the left, "you drive a car in the course of your professional work?" "Yes, sir, I do. I've driven one for years, but I still don't know how it works, and if I break down, I have to scream for help." "I see. I see." The smiles were very thin now, and the three heads came together for a whispered consultation. Finally, the middle one leant across the table. "Tell you what, Herriot, how would you like to be a meteorologist?" "Fine," I replied. I sympathized with them, because they were obviously kind men, but I've never had any faith in aptitude tests since then. Of course, there was never the slightest chance of my becoming a meteorologist, and I suppose that's how I landed in the stores. It was one of the bizarre periods of my life, mercifully brief, but vivid. They had told me to report to Corporal Weeks at the store's hut, and I made my way through the maze of roads of a Heaton Park populated by strangers. Corporal Weeks was fat, and he gave me a quick look over with crafty eyes. "Herriot, eh? Well, you can make yourself useful around here. Not much to do, really. This ain't the main stores. We deal mainly with laundry and boot repairs." As he spoke, a fair-haired young man came in. "AC2 Morgan, Corporal," he said. "Come for me boots. They've been resoled." Wiggs jerked his head, and I had my first sight of the boot mountain. "They're in there. They'll be labelled." The young man looked surprised, but he came round behind the counter and began to delve among the hundreds of identical black objects. It took him nearly an hour to find his own pair, during which the corporal puffed at cigarettes with a total lack of interest. When the boots were finally unearthed, he wordlessly ticked off the name on a long list. "This is the sort of thing you'll be doing," he said to me. "Nothing to it." He wasn't exaggerating. There was nothing to life in those stores. It took me only a day or two to realize the sweet existence Weeks had carved out for himself. Store bashing is an honourable trade, but not the way he did it. The innumerable compartments, niches and alcoves around the big hut were all marked with letters or numbers, and there is no doubt the incoming boots and shirts should have been tucked away in order for easy recovery. But that would have involved work, and the corporal was clearly averse to that. When the boots came in, they were tipped out in the middle of the floor, and the string-tied packages of laundry were stacked, shirts uppermost, where they formed a blue tumulus reaching almost to the roof. After 3 days, I could stand it no longer. "Look," I said, "it would pass the time if I had something to do. Do you mind if I start putting all this stuff on the shelves? It would be a lot easier to hand out." Weeks continued to study his magazine. He was a big reader, and at first I thought he hadn't heard me. Then he tongued his cigarette to the corner of his mouth and glanced at me through the smoke. "Now just get this through your head, mate," he drawled. "If I want any thing doing, I'll tell you. I'm the boss in here, and I give the orders, all right?" He resumed his perusal of the magazine. I subsided in my chair. Clearly I had offended my overseer, and I would have to leave things as they were. But overseer is a misnomer for Weeks, because on the following day, after a final brainwashing that the procedure must remain unchanged, he disappeared, and except for a few minutes each morning, he left me on my own. I had nothing to do but sit there behind the wooden counter, ticking off the comings and goings of the boots and shirts, and I had the feeling that I was only one of many displaced persons who had fallen under his thrall. I found it acutely embarrassing to watch the lads scrabbling for their belongings, and the strongest impression left with me was of the infinite tolerance of the British race. Since I was in charge, they thought I was responsible for the whole system. But despite the fact that I was of lowly rank, nobody attacked me physically. Most of them muttered and grumbled as they searched, and one large chap came over to the counter and said, "You should be filing away these boots in their proper order instead of sitting there on your arse, you lazy sod." But he didn't punch me on the nose, and I marvelled at it. But still, the knowledge that great numbers of decent young men shared his opinion was uncomfortable, and I found I was developing a permanently ingratiating smile. The only time I came very near to being lynched was when a mob suddenly appeared one afternoon. An unexpected leave pass had been granted, and there were hundreds of men milling around on the tarmac and grass outside the stores. They wanted their laundry, and quick, because they had trains to catch. For a moment, panic seized me. I couldn't let them all inside to fight for their shirts. Then inspiration came. I grabbed an armful of the flat packets from the table and shouted the name on the label. "Walters?" And from somewhere among the surging heads an eager voice replied, "Here!" I located the source, held the packet between thumb and finger, and with a backhanded flick sent it skimming over the crowd. "Riley? Here! MacDonald? Here! Gibson? Here!" I was getting quite skillful at it, propelling the blue oblongs unerringly towards their owners, but it was a slow method of distribution. Also, there were occasional disasters when the strings broke in mid-air, sending a shower of collars on the upturned faces. Sometimes the shirts themselves burst free from their wrappings and plunged to earth. It wasn't long before the voices had turned from eager to angry. As my projectiles planed and glided, volleys of abuse came back at me. "You've made me miss my train, you useless bugger!" "Bloody skiver, you want locking up!" Much of it was in stronger language, which I would rather not record here. But I have a particularly vivid memory of one young man scraping up his laundry from the dusty ground and approaching me with rapid strides. He pushed his face to within inches of mine. Despite the rage which disfigured it, I could see it was a gentle, good-natured face. He looked a well-bred lad, the type who didn't even swear, but as he stared into my eyes, his lips trembled and his cheeks twitched. "This is a," he stammered, "this is a bastard system." He spat the words out and strode away. I agreed entirely with him, of course, but continued to hurl the packets doggedly while somewhere in the back of my mind the little voice kept inquiring how James Herriot, member of the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons and trainee pilot, had ever got into this. After half an hour there was no appreciable diminution in the size of the multitude, and I began to be aware of an increasing restlessness among the medley of waiting faces. Suddenly there was a concerted movement, and the packed mass of men surged at me in a great wave. I shrank back, clutching an armful of shirts, quite certain that this was when they rushed me and beat me up, but my fears were groundless. All they wanted was a speedier delivery, and about a dozen of them swept past me behind the counter and began to follow my example. Whereas there had been only a single missile winging over their heads, the sky was now dark with the flying objects. Mid-air collisions were frequent, collars sprayed, handkerchiefs fluttered, underpants parachuted gracefully, but after an unbearably long period of chaos, the last airman had picked up his scattered laundry, given me a disgusted glance, and departed. I was left in the hut with the sad knowledge that my prestige was very low, and the equally sad conviction that the RAF still did not know what to do with me. Chapter 44. Occasionally my period in limbo was relieved when I was allowed out of camp into the city of Manchester, and I suppose it was the fact that I was a new-fangled parent that made me look at the various prams in the street. Mostly the prams were pushed by women, but now and then I saw a man doing the job. I suppose it isn't unusual to see a man pushing a pram in a town, but on a lonely moorland road the sight merits a second glance, especially when the pram contains a large dog. That was what I saw in the hills above Darrowby one morning, and I slowed down as I drove past. I had noticed the strange combination before, on several occasions over the last few weeks, and it was clear that man and dog had recently moved into the district. As the car drew abreast of him, the man turned, smiled, and raised his hand. It was a smile of rare sweetness in a very brown face. A 40-year-old face, I thought, above a brown neck which bore neither collar nor tie, and a faded, striped shirt lying open over a bare chest despite the coldness of the day. I couldn't help wondering who or what he was. The outfit of scuffed suede golf jacket, corduroy trousers, and mighty sturdy boots didn't give much clue. Some people might have put him down as an ordinary tramp, but there was a businesslike, energetic look about him which didn't quite fit the term. I wound the window down, and the thin wind of a Yorkshire March bit at my cheeks. "Nippy this morning," I said. The man seemed surprised. "Aye?" he replied after a moment. "Aye? Reckon it is." I looked at the pram, ancient and rusty, and at the big animal sitting upright inside it. He was a lurcher, a crossbred greyhound, and he gazed back at me with unruffled dignity. "Nice dog," I said. "Aye, that's Jake." The man smiled again, showing good regular teeth. "He's a grand 'un." I waved and drove on. In the mirror I could see the compact figure, stepping out briskly, head up, shoulders squared, and, rising like a statue from the middle of the pram, the huge, brindled form of Jake. I didn't have to wait long to meet the unlikely pair again. I was examining a cart-horse's teeth in a farmyard when on the hillside beyond the stable I saw a figure kneeling by a dry stone wall, and by his side a pram and a big dog sitting patiently on the grass. "Hey, just a minute." I pointed at the hill. "Who is that?" The farmer laughed. "That's Roddy Travers. Do you ken him?" No, I don't. I had a word with him on the road the other day, that's all." "Aye, on the road." He nodded knowingly. "That's where you'd see Roddy right enough." "But what is he? Where does he come from?" "He comes from somewhere in Yorkshire, but I don't rightly know where, and I don't think anybody else does. But I'll tell you this, he can turn his hand to anything." "Yes," I said, watching the man expertly laying the flat slabs of stone as he repaired a gap in the wall. "There's not many men can do what he's doing now." "That's true. Walling is a skilled job, and it's dying out but Roddy's a dab hand at it. But he can do out. Edging, ditching, looking after stock, it's all the same to him." I lifted the tooth rasp and began to rub a few sharp corners off the horse's molars. "And how long will he stay here?" "Oh, when he's finished that wall, he'll be off. I could do with him stopping around for a bit, but he never stays in one place for long." "But hasn't he got a home anywhere?" Nay. The farmer laughed again. "Roddy's got nowt. All he has in the world is in that there pram." Over the next weeks, as the harsh spring began to soften, and the sunshine brought a bright speckle of primroses onto the grassy banks, I saw Roddy quite often, sometimes on the road, occasionally wielding a spade busily on the ditches around the fields. Jake was always there, either loping by his side or watching him at work. But we didn't actually meet again till I was inoculating Mr. Pawson's sheep for pulpy kidney. There were 300 to do, and they drove them in batches into a small pen where Roddy caught and held them for me. And I could see he was an expert at this, too. The wild hill sheep whipped past him like bullets, but he seized their fleece effortlessly, sometimes in mid-air, and held the foreleg up to expose that bare, clean area of skin behind the elbow that nature seemed to provide for the veterinary surgeon's needle. Outside, on the windy slopes, the big lurcher sat upright in typical pose, looking with mild interest at the farm dogs prowling intently around the pens, but not interfering in any way. "You've got him well trained," I said. Roddy smiled. "Yes, you'll never find Jake dashing about annoying people. He knows he has to sit there till I'm finished, and there he'll sit." And quite happy to do so by the look of him. I glanced again at the dog, a picture of contentment. "He must live a wonderful life travelling everywhere with you." "You're right there." Mr. Pawson broke in as he ushered another bunch of sheep into the pen. "He hasn't a care in the world, just like his master." Roddy didn't say anything, but as the sheep ran in, he straightened up and took a long, steady breath. He'd been working hard, and a little trickle of sweat ran down the side of his forehead. But as he gazed over the wide sweep of moor and fell, I could read utter serenity in his face. After a few moments, he spoke. "I reckon that's true. We haven't much to worry us, Jake and me." Mr. Pawson grinned mischievously. "By God, Roddy, you've never spoke a truer word. No wife, no kids, no life insurance, no overdraft at bank. You must have a right peaceful existence." "I suppose so," Roddy said. "But then I've no money either." The farmer gave him a quizzical look. "Aye. How about that, then? Wouldn't you feel a bit more secure-like if you had a bit of brass put by? Nay, you can't take it with you. In any road, as long as a man can pay his way, he's got enough." There was nothing original about the words, but they have stayed with me all my life because they came from his lips and were spoken with such profound assurance. When I had finished the inoculations and the ewes were turned out to trot back happily over the open fields, I turned to Roddy. "Well, thanks very much. It makes my job a lot quicker when I have a good catcher like you." I pulled out a packet of Gold Flake. "Will you have a cigarette?" "No, thank you, Mr. Herriot. I don't smoke." "You don't?" "No. Don't drink either." He gave me his gentle smile, and again I had the impression of physical and mental purity. No drinking, no smoking, a life of constant movement in the open air without material possessions or ambitions. It all showed in the unclouded eyes, the fresh skin and the hard, muscular frame. He wasn't very big, but he looked indestructible. "Come on, Jake, it's dinner time," he said, and the big lurcher bounded around him in delight. I went over and spoke to the dog, and he responded with tremendous body-swaying wags, his handsome face looking up at me, full of friendliness. I stroked the long, pointed head and tickled the ears. "He's a beauty, Roddy. A grand un, as you said." I walked to the house to wash my hands, and before I went inside I glanced back at the two of them. They were sitting in the shelter of a wall, and Roddy was laying out a thermos flask and a parcel of food while Jake watched eagerly. The hard, bright sunshine beat on them as the wind whistled over the top of the wall. They looked supremely comfortable and at peace. "He's independent, you see," the farmer's wife said as I stood at the kitchen sink. "He's welcome to come in for a bit of dinner, but he'd rather stay outside with his dog." I nodded. "Where does he sleep when he's going round the farms like this?" "Oh, anywhere," she replied. "In hay barns or granaries or sometimes out in the open. But when he's with us, he sleeps upstairs in one of our rooms. I know for a fact any of the farmers would be willing to have him in the house because he always keeps himself spotless clean." "I see." I pulled the towel from behind the door. "He's quite a character, isn't he?" She smiled, ruminatively. "Aye, he certainly is. Just him and his dog." She lifted a fragrant dishful of hot roast ham from the oven and set it on the table. "But I'll tell you this. The fella's all right. Everybody likes Roddy Travers. He's a very nice man." Roddy stayed around the Darrowby district throughout the summer, and I grew used to the sight of him on the farms or pushing his pram along the roads. When it was raining, he wore a tattered, overlong gabardine coat, but at other times it was always the golf jacket and corduroys. I don't know where he had accumulated his wardrobe. It was a safe bet he had never been on a golf course in his life, and it was just another of the little mysteries about him. I saw him early one morning on a hill path in early October. It had been a night of iron frost, and the tussocky pastures beyond the walls were held in a pitiless white grip, with every blade of grass stiffly ensheathed in rime. I was muffled to the eyes and had been beating my gloved fingers against my knees to thaw them out. But when I pulled up and wound down the window, the first thing I saw was the bare chest under the collarless, unbuttoned shirt. "Morning, Mr. Herriot," he said. "I'm glad I've seen you." He paused and gave me his tranquil smile. "There's a job along road for a couple of weeks, then I'm moving on." "I see." I knew enough about him now not to ask where he was going. Instead, I looked down at Jake, who was sniffling the herbage. "I see he's walking this morning." Roddy laughed. "Yes, sometimes he likes to walk, sometimes he likes to ride. He pleases himself." "Right, Roddy," I said. "No doubt we'll meet again. All the best to you." He waved and set off jauntily over the ice-bound road, and I felt that a little vein of richness had gone from my life. but I was wrong. That same evening, about 8 o'clock, the doorbell rang. I answered it and found Roddy on the front doorstep. Behind him, just visible in the frosty darkness, stood the ubiquitous pram. "I want you to look at me dog, Mr. Herriot," he said. "Why? What's the trouble?" "I don't rightly know. He's having sort of fainting fits." "Fainting fits? That doesn't sound like Jake. Where is he, anyway?" He pointed behind him. "In pram, under cover." "All right." I threw the door wide open. "Bring him in." Roddy adroitly manhandled the rusty old vehicle up the steps and pushed it, squeaking and rattling, along the passage to the consulting room. There, under the bright lights, he snapped back the fasteners and threw off the cover to reveal Jake stretched beneath. His head was pillowed on the familiar gabardine coat, and around him lay his master's worldly goods. A string-tied bundle of spare shirt and socks, a packet of tea, a thermos, knife and spoon, and an ex-army haversack. The big dog looked up at me with terrified eyes, and as I patted him I could feel his whole frame quivering. "Let him lie there a minute, Roddy," I said, "and tell me exactly what you've seen." He rubbed his palms together, and his fingers trembled. "Well, it only started this afternoon. He was right as rain, larking about on the grass. Then he went into a sort of fit." "How do you mean?" "Just kind of seized up and toppled over on his side. He lay there for a bit, gasping and slavering. I tell you, I thought he was a goner." His eyes widened, and a corner of his mouth twitched at the memory. "How long did that last?" "Not but a few seconds. Then he got up, and you'd say there was naught wrong with him." "But he did it again." "Aye, time and time again. Drove me near daft. But in between he was normal. Normal, Mr. Herriot." It sounded ominously like the onset of epilepsy. "How old is he?" I asked. 5, gone last February." "Ah, well, it was a bit old for that." I reached for a stethoscope and auscultated the heart. I listened intently, but heard only the racing beat of a frightened animal. There was no abnormality. My thermometer showed no rise in temperature. "Let's have him on the table, Roddy. You take the back end." The big animal was limp in our arms as we hoisted him onto the smooth surface. But after lying there for a moment, he looked timidly around him, then sat up with a slow and careful movement. As we watched, he reached out and licked his master's face while his tail flickered between his legs. "Look at that," the man exclaimed. "He's all right again. You'd think he didn't ail a thing." And indeed, Jake was recovering his confidence rapidly. He peered tentatively at the floor a few times, then suddenly jumped down, trotted to his master, and put his paws against his chest. I looked at the dog standing there, tail wagging furiously. Well, that's a relief anyway. I didn't like the look of him just then, but whatever's been troubling him seems to have righted itself. My happy flow was cut off. I stared at the lurcher. His forelegs were on the floor again, and his mouth was gaping as he fought for breath. Frantically, he gasped and retched as he blundered across the floor, collided with the pram wheels, and fell on his side. "What the hell? Quick, get him up again!" I grabbed the animal round the middle, and we lifted him back onto the table. I watched in disbelief as the huge form lay there. There was no fight for breath now. He wasn't breathing at all. He was unconscious. I pushed my fingers inside his thigh and felt the pulse. It was still going, rapid and feeble, but yet he didn't breathe. He could die any moment, and I stood there helpless, all my scientific training useless. Finally, my frustration burst from me, and I struck the dog on the ribs with the flat of my hand. "Jake!" I yelled. "Jake, what's the matter with you?" As though in reply, the lurcher immediately started to take great wheezing breaths. His eyelids twitched back to consciousness, and he began to look about him. But he was still mortally afraid, and he lay prone as I gently stroked his head. There was a long silence while the animal's terror slowly subsided. Then he sat up on the table and regarded us placidly. "There you are," Roddy said softly. "Same thing again. I can't reckon it up, and I thought I knew something about dogs." I didn't say anything. I couldn't reckon it up either, and I was supposed to be a veterinary surgeon. I spoke at last. "Roddy, that wasn't a fit. He was choking. Something was interfering with his airflow." I took my hand torch from my breast pocket. I'm going to have a look at his throat. I pushed Jake's jaws apart, depressing his tongue with a forefinger, and shone the light into the depths. He was the kind of good-natured dog who offered no resistance as I prodded around, but despite my floodlit view of the pharynx, I could find nothing wrong. I'd been hoping desperately to come across a bit of bone stuck there somewhere, but I ranged feverishly over pink tongue, healthy tonsils, and gleaming molars without success. Everything looked perfect. I was tilting his head a little further when I felt him stiffen and heard Roddy's cry. "He's going again!" And he was, too. I stared in horror as the brindled body slid away from me and lay prostrate once more on the table, and again the mouth strained wide and froth bubbled round the lips. As before, the breathing had stopped and the rib-cage was motionless. As the seconds ticked away, I beat on the chest with my hand, but it didn't work this time. I pulled the lower eyelid down from the staring orb. The conjunctiva was blue. Jake hadn't long to live. The tragedy of the thing bore down on me. This wasn't just a dog. He was this man's family, and I was watching him die. It was at that moment that I heard the faint sound. It was a strangled cough which barely stirred the dog's lips. "Damn it!" I shouted. "He is choking! There must be something down there!" Again I seized the head and pushed my torch into the mouth, and I shall always be thankful that at that very instant the dog coughed again, opening the cartilages of the larynx and giving me a glimpse of the cause of all the trouble. There, beyond the drooping epiglottis, I saw for a fleeting moment a smooth, round object no bigger than a pea. "I think it's a pebble," I gasped. "Right inside his larynx." "You mean in his Adam's apple?" "That's right, and it's acting like a ball valve, blocking his windpipe every now and then." I shook the dog's head. "You see, look, I've dislodged it for the moment. He's coming round again." Once more Jake was reviving and breathing steadily. Roddy ran his hand over the head, along the back and down the great muscles of the hind limbs. But it'll happen again, won't it?" I nodded. "I'm afraid so." "And one of these times it isn't going to shift, and that'll be the end of him." He had gone very pale. "That's about it, Roddy. I'll have to get that pebble out." "But how?" "Cut into the larynx. And right now, it's the only way." "All right." He swallowed. "Let's get on. I don't think I could stand it if he went down again." I knew what he meant. My knees had begun to shake, and I had a strong conviction that if Jake collapsed once more, then so would I. I seized a pair of scissors and clipped away the hair from the ventral surface of the larynx. I dared not use a general anaesthetic, and infiltrated the area with local before swabbing with antiseptic. Mercifully, there was a freshly boiled set of instruments lying in the sterilizer, and I lifted out the tray and set it on the trolley by the side of the table. "Hold his head steady," I said hoarsely, and gripped a scalpel. I cut down through skin, fascia, and the thin layers of the sternohyoid and the omohyoid muscles, till the ventral surface of the larynx was revealed. This was something I'd never done to a live dog before, but desperation abolished any hesitancy, and it took me only another few seconds to incise the thin membrane and peer into the interior. And there it was. A pebble right enough, grey and glistening and tiny, but big enough to kill. I had to fish it out quickly and cleanly, without pushing it into the trachea. I leant back and rummaged in the tray till I found some broad-bladed forceps, then I poised them over the wound. Great surgeons' hands, I felt sure, didn't shake like this. Nor did such men pant as I was doing. But I clenched my teeth, introduced the forceps, and my hand magically steadied as I clamped them over the pebble. I stopped panting, too. In fact, I didn't breathe at all as I bore the shining little object slowly and tenderly through the opening and dropped it with a gentle rat-tat on the table. "Is that it?" asked Roddy, almost in a whisper. "That's it." I reached for a needle and suture silk. "All is well now." The stitching took only a few minutes, and by the end of it Jake was bright-eyed and alert, paws shifting impatiently, ready for anything. He seemed to know his troubles were over. Roddy brought him back in 10 days to have the stitches removed. It was, in fact, the very morning he was leaving the Derby district, and after I had picked the few loops of silk from the nicely healed wound, I walked with him to the front door while Jake capered round our feet. On the pavement outside Scaledale House, the ancient pram stood in all its high, rusted dignity. Roddy pulled back the cover. "Up, boy," he murmured, and the big dog leapt effortlessly into his accustomed place. Roddy took hold of the handle with both hands, and as the autumn sunshine broke suddenly through the clouds, it lit up a picture which had grown familiar and part of the daily scene. The golf jacket, the open shirt and brown chest, the handsome animal sitting up looking around him with natural grace. "Well, so long, Roddy," I said. "I suppose you'll be around these parts again." He turned and I saw that smile again. "Aye, reckon I'll be back." He gave a push and they were off, the strange vehicle creaking, Jake swaying gently as they went down the street. The memory came back to me of what I had seen under the cover that night in the surgery. The haversack, which would contain his razor, towel, soap, and a few other things, the packet of tea and the thermos, and something else, a tiny dog collar. Could it have belonged to Jake as a pup, or to another loved animal? It added a little more mystery to the man, and explained other things too. The farmer had been right. All Roddy possessed was in that pram. And it seemed it was all he desired, too, because as he turned the corner and disappeared from my view, I could hear him whistling. Chapter 45. I have never been much good at small talk, but as I sat in the stores day after day without seeing a friendly face, I realized how much I used to enjoy chatting with the farmers during my veterinary calls. It is one of the nicest things about country practice, but you have to keep your mind on the job at the same time, or you could be in trouble. And at Mr. Duggleby's I nearly landed in the biggest trouble of all. He was a smallholder who kept a few sows and reared the litters to pork weight in some ramshackle sheds behind the railway line outside Darrowby. He was also a cricket fanatic, steeped in the lore and history of the game, and he would talk about it for hours on end. He never tired of it. I was a willing listener because cricket has always fascinated me, even though I grew up in Scotland, where it is little played. As I moved among the young pigs, only part of my attention was focused on the little animals. Most of me was out on the great green oval at Headingley with the Yorkshire heroes. "By God, you should have seen Len Hutton on Saturday," he breathed reverently. 180 and never gave a chance. It was lovely to watch him. He gave a fair imitation of the great man's cover drive. "Yes, I can imagine it." I nodded and smiled. "You said these pigs were lame, Mr. Duggleby?" "Aye. Noticed a few of 'em mopping about with a leg up this morning. And you know, Maurice Leyland was nearly as good. Not as classy as Len, I knows, but by heck he can clump 'em." "Yes, he's a lion-hearted little player, is Maurice," I said. I reached down, grabbed a pig by the tail and thrust my thermometer into its rectum. "Remember him and Eddie Painter in the test match against Australia?" He gave a dreamy smile. "Remember it? By God, that's something I'll never forget. What a day that was." I withdrew the thermometer. "This little chap's got a temperature of 105. Must be some infection somewhere, maybe a touch of joint ill." I felt my way along the small pink limbs. And yet it's funny. The joints aren't swollen. I reckon Bill Bowe'll skittle Somerset out when they start their innings today. This wicket's to his liking." "Yes, he's a great bowler, isn't he?" I said. "I love watching a good fast bowler. I suppose you'll have seen them all. Larwood, Boucher, Geo Allen, and the rest." "Aye, that I have. I could go on all day about those men." I caught another of the lame pigs and examined it. "This is rather strange, Mr. Duggleby. About half the pigs in this pen seem to be lame, but there's nothing to see." "Aye, well, happen it's like you said. Joint ill. You can give 'em a jab for that, can't you? And while you're doing it, I'll tell you of the time I saw Wilfred Rhodes take 8 wickets in an afternoon." I filled a syringe. "Right, we'd better give them all a shot. Have you got a marking pencil there?" The farmer nodded and lifted one of the little animals, which promptly unleashed a protesting scream. "There was never anybody like our Wilfrid," he shouted above the noise. "It was about 2:30, and the wicket had had a shower of rain on it when Skipper threw him the ball." I smiled and raised my syringe. It passed the time so pleasantly listening to these reminiscences. Well content, I was about to plunge the needle into the pink thigh when one of the pigs began to nibble at the heel of my Wellington. I looked down at a ring of the little creatures all looking up at me, alarmed by the shrill screeches of their friend. My mind was still with Wilfrid Rhodes when I noticed what looked like a small white knob on one of the up-tilted snouts. And there was another on that one, and that one. I had been unable to see their faces until now because they had been trying to run away from me, but a warning bell clanged suddenly in my head. I reached down and seized a pig, and as I squeezed the swelling on the snout, a cold wind blew through me, scattering the gentle vision of cricket and sunshine and green grass. It wasn't a knob. It was a vesicle, a delicate blister which ruptured easily on pressure. I could feel my arm shaking as I turned the piglet up and began to examine the tiny cloven feet. There were more vesicles there, flatter and more diffuse, but telling the same dread story. Dry-mouthed, I lifted 2 other pigs. They were just the same. As I turned to the farmer, I felt bowed down by a crushing weight of pity, almost of guilt. He was still smiling eagerly, anxious to get on with his tale, and I was about to give him the worst news a veterinary surgeon can give a stockman. "Mr. Duggleby," I said, "I'm afraid I'll have to telephone the Ministry of Agriculture." "The Ministry? What for?" "To tell them that I have a case of suspected foot-and-mouth disease." "Foot and mouth? Never." "Yes, I'm terribly sorry." "Are you sure?" "It's not up to me to be definite about it, Mr. Duggleby. One of the Ministry officers will have to do that. I must phone them right away." It was an unlikely place to find a telephone, but Mr. Duggleby ran a little coal delivery round on the side. I was quickly through to the Ministry, and I spoke to Neville Craggs, one of the full-time officers. He groaned. "Sounds awfully like it, Jim. Anyway, stay put till I see you." In the farm kitchen, Mr. Duggleby looked at me inquiringly. "What now?" "You'll just have to put up with me for a bit," I said. "I can't leave till I get the verdict." He was silent for a moment. "What happens if it's what you think?" "I'm afraid your pigs will have to be slaughtered." "Every one of them?" "That is the law. I'm sorry, but you'll get compensation." He scratched his head. "But they can get better. Why do you have to kill them all?" "You're quite right," I shrugged. "Many animals do recover, but foot-and-mouth is fiercely infectious. While you were treating them, it would have spread to neighbouring farms, then all over the country." "Aye, but look at the expense. Slaughtering must cost thousands of pounds." "I agree, but it would cost a lot more the other way. Apart from the animals that die, just think of the loss of milk, loss of flesh in cows, pigs and sheep. It would come to millions every year. It's lucky Britain is an island." "Reckon you'll be right." He felt for his pipe. "And you're pretty sure I've got it?" "Yes." "Ah, well," he murmured, "these things happen." The old Yorkshire words. I had heard them so often under circumstances which would make most city folk, including myself, beat their heads against a wall. Mr. Duggleby's small holdings would soon be a silent place of death, but he just chewed his pipe and said, "These things happen." It didn't take the Ministry long to make up their minds. The source of the infection was almost certainly some imported meat which Mr. Duggleby hadn't boiled properly with his swill. The disease was confirmed, and a 15-mile radius standstill order was imposed. I disinfected myself and my car and went home. I undressed, my clothes were taken away for fumigation, and I climbed into a hot antiseptic bath. Lying there in the steam, I pondered on what might have been. If I had failed to spot the disease, I would have gone merrily on my way, spreading destruction and havoc. I always washed my boots before leaving a farm, but how about those little pigs nibbling around the hem of my long coat? How about my syringe, even my thermometer? My next call was to have been to Terence Bailey's pedigree herd of dairy shorthorns. 200 peerless cows, a strain built up over generations. Foreigners came from all over the world to buy them, and I could have been the cause of their annihilation. And then there was Mr. Duggleby himself. I could picture him rattling around the farms in his coal wagon. He would have done his bit of spreading too. And, like as not, he would have taken a few store pigs to the auction mart this week, sending the deadly contagion all over Yorkshire and beyond. It was easy to see how a major outbreak could have started. A disaster of national importance costing millions. If I hadn't been sweating already, I would have started now at the very thought of it. I would have joined the unhappy band of practitioners who had missed foot and mouth. I knew of some of these people, and my heart bled for them. It could happen so easily. Busy men trying to examine kicking, struggling animals in dark buildings with perhaps part of their mind on the list of calls ahead. And the other hazards. The total unexpectedness. The atypical cases. Various distractions. My distraction had been cricket, and it had nearly caused my downfall. But I had escaped, and, huddling lower in the hot water, I said a silent prayer of thanks. Later, with a complete change of clothes and instruments, I continued on my rounds, and as I stood in Tenants Bailey's long byre, I realized my luck again. The long rows of beautiful animals, meticulously groomed, firm high udders pushing between their hocks, delicate heads, fine legs deep in straw. They were a picture of bovine perfection, and quite irreplaceable. Once foot and mouth is confirmed in a district, there is a tense period of waiting. Farmers, veterinary surgeons, and most of all, ministry officials are on the rack, wondering if there has been any dissemination before diagnosis, bracing themselves against the telephone message which could herald the raging spread which they dreaded, and which would tear their lives apart. To the city dwellers, a big foot-and-mouth outbreak is something remote which they read about in the newspapers. To the country folk, it means the transformation of the quiet farms and fields into charnel houses and funeral pyres. It means heartbreak and ruin. We waited in Darrowby, and as the days passed and no frightening news of lame or salivating animals came over the wires, it seemed that the Duggleby episode was what we hoped, an isolated case caused by a few shreds of imported meat. I almost bathed in disinfectant on every farm, sloshing a strong solution of Lysol over my boots and protective clothing so that my car reeked of the stuff, and I caused wrinkled noses when I entered a shop, the post office, the bank. After nearly 2 weeks, I had begun to feel reasonably safe. But when I had a call from the famous Bailey farm, I felt a twinge of apprehension. It was Terence Bailey himself. "Will you come and see one of me cows, Mr. Herriot? She's got blisters on one of her teats." "Blisters?" My heart went bump. "Is she slavering? Is she lame?" Nay, she just has these nasty blisters. Seems to have fluid in 'em." I was breathless as I put down the receiver. One nasty blister would be enough. It sometimes started like that in cows. I almost ran out to my car, and on the journey my mind beat about like a trapped bird. Bailey's was the farm I had visited straight from Duggleby's. Could I possibly have carried it there? But the change of clothes, the bath, the fresh thermometer, and instruments. What more could I do? How about my car wheels? Well, I had disinfected them too. I couldn't possibly be blamed, but... It was Mr. Bailey's wife who met me. "I noticed this cow when I was milking this morning, Mr. Herriot." The herd was still hand-milked, and in the hard-working family tradition Mrs. Bailey did her stint night and morning with her husband and the farm men. "As soon as I got hold of the teats, I could see the cow was uneasy," she continued. "Then I saw there were a lot of little blisters, and one big one. I managed to milk her, and most of the little blisters burst, but the big one's still there." I bent and peered anxiously at the udder. It was, as she said, lots of small ruptured vesicles and one large one, intact and fluctuating. It was all horribly evocative, and without speaking I moved along, grasped the cow's nose, and pulled her head round. I prized the mouth open and stared desperately at lips, cheek, and dental pad. I think I would have fainted if I'd found anything in there, but it was all clean and normal. I lifted each forefoot in turn and scrubbed out the clefts with soap and water. Nothing. I tied a rope round the hind leg, threw it over a beam, and with the help of one of the men, pulled the foot up. More scrubbing and searching without success, then the same with the other hindfoot. When I finished, I was perspiring, but no further forward. I took the temperature and found it slightly elevated, then I walked up and down the byre. "Is there any trouble among these other cows?" I asked. Mrs. Bailey shook her head. "No, there's just this one." She was a good-looking woman in her 30s, with the red, roughened complexion of the outdoor worker. "What do you think it is?" I didn't dare tell her. I had a cow with vesicles on the teats right in the middle of a district under foot-and-mouth restrictions. I just couldn't take a chance. I had to bring the ministry in. Even then, I was unable to speak the dread words. All I could say was, "Can I use your phone, please?" She looked surprised, but smiled quickly. "Yes, of course. Come into the house." As I walked down the byre, I looked again at the beautiful cows, and then beyond, at the fold yard where I could see the young heifers and the tiny calves in their pens, all of them carrying the Bailey blood, which had been produced and perfected by generations of careful breeding and selection. But a humane killer is no respecter of such things, and if my fears were realized, a quick series of bang-bangs would wipe out all this in an hour or two. We went into the farm kitchen, and Mrs. Bailey pointed to the door at the far end. "The phone's through there in the front room," she said. I kicked off my Wellingtons and was padding across the floor in my stocking feet when I almost fell over Giles, the lusty 1-year-old baby of the family, as he waddled across my path. I bent to ease him out of the way, and he looked up at me with an enormous, cheesy grin. His mother laughed. "Just look at him. Full of the devil. And he's had such a painful arm since his smallpox vaccination." "Poor lad," I said absently, patting his head as I opened the door, my mind already busy with the uncomfortable conversation ahead. I had taken a few strides over the carpet beyond, when I halted abruptly. I turned and looked back into the kitchen. "Did you say smallpox vaccination?" "Yes. All our other children had been done when they were his age, but they never reacted like this. I've had to change his dressing every day." "You changed his dressing? And you milked that cow?" "Yes, that's right." A great light beamed suddenly, spilling sunshine into my dark, troubled world. I returned to the kitchen and closed the door behind me. Mrs. Bailey looked at me for a moment in silence, then she spoke, hesitantly. "Aren't you going to use the phone?" "No, no," I replied. "I've changed my mind." "I see." She raised her eyebrows and seemed at a loss for words. Then she smiled and lifted the kettle. "Well, maybe you'll have a cup of tea, then?" "Thank you. That would be lovely." I sank happily on to one of the hard wooden chairs. Mrs. Bailey put the kettle on and turned to me. "By the way, you never told me what's wrong with that cow." "Oh, yes, of course, I'm sorry," I said airily, as though I'd just forgotten to mention it. "She's got cowpox. In fact, you gave it to her." "I gave—" "What do you mean?" "Well, the vaccine they use for babies is made from the cowpox virus. You carried it in on your hands from the baby to the cow." I smiled, enjoying my big moment. Her mouth fell open slightly. Then she began to giggle. "Oh, dear. I don't know what my husband's going to say. I've never heard anything like that." She wiggled her fingers in front of her eyes. "And I'm always so careful, too. But I've been a bit harassed with the poor little chap's arm." "Oh, well, it isn't serious," I said. "I've got some ointment in the car, which will cure it quite quickly." I sipped my tea and watched Giles' activities. In a short time he had spread chaos throughout the kitchen, and at the moment was busily engaged in removing all the contents of a cupboard in the corner. Bent double, small bottom outthrust, he hurled pans, lids, brushes behind him with intense dedication till the cupboard was empty. Then, as he looked round for further employment, he spotted me and tacked towards me on straddled legs. My stocking-clad toes seemed to fascinate him, and as I wiggled them at him, he grasped at them with fat little hands. When he had finally trapped my big toe, he looked up at me with his huge grin in which 4 tiny teeth glittered. I smiled back at him with sincere affection as the relief flowed through me. It wasn't just that I was grateful to him. I really liked him. I still like Giles today. He is one of my clients, a burly farmer with a family of his own, a deep love and knowledge of pedigree cows, and the same big grin, except there are a few more teeth in it. But he'll never know how near his smallpox vaccination came to giving me heart failure. Chapter 46. They had sent me to Eastchurch on the Isle of Sheppey, and I knew it was the last stop. As I looked along the disorderly line of men, I realized I wouldn't be taking part in many more parades. And it came to me with a pang that at the Scarborough Initial Training Wing, this would not have been classed as a parade at all. I could remember the ranks of blue outside the Grand Hotel, straight as the Grenadier Guards, and every man standing stiffly, looking neither to left nor right, our boots gleaming, buttons shining like gold, and not a movement anywhere as the flight sergeant led the officer round on morning inspection. I had moaned as loudly as anybody at the rigid discipline, the bull, the scrubbing and polishing, marching and drilling. But now that it had all gone, it seemed good and meaningful, and I missed it. Here the files of airmen lounged, chatted among themselves, and occasionally took a surreptitious drag at a cigarette as a sergeant out in front called the names from a list and gave us our leisurely instructions for the day. This particular morning he was taking a long time over it, consulting sheaves of papers and making laboured notes with a pencil. A big Irishman on my right was becoming increasingly restive, and finally he shouted testily, "For sake, Sergeant, get us off this square. My feet are killing me." The sergeant didn't even look up. "Shut your mouth, Brady," he replied. "You'll get off the square when I say so, and not before." It was like that at Eastchurch, the great filter tank of the RAF, where what I had heard described as the odds and sods were finally sorted out. It was a big, sprawling camp, filled with a widely varied mixture of airmen who had one thing in common. They were all waiting. Some of them for remuster, but most for discharge from the service. There was a resigned air about the whole place, an acceptance of the fact that we were all just putting in time. There was a token discipline, but it was of the most benign kind, and, as I said, every man there was just waiting. Waiting. Little Ned Finch, in his remote corner of the high Yorkshire Dales, always seemed to me to be waiting too. I could remember his boss yelling at him, "For God's sake, shape up to job, you're not farming, it's y'all." Mr. Daggett grabbed hold of a leaping calf and glared in exasperation. Ned gazed back at him impassively. His face registered no particular emotion, but in the pale blue eyes I read the expression that was always there, as though he was waiting for something to happen, but without much hope. He made a tentative attempt to catch a calf, but was brushed aside. Then he put his arms around the neck of another one, a chunky little animal of 3 months, and was borne along a few yards before being deposited on his back in the straw. "Oh, dang it, do this one, Mr. Herriot!" Mr. Daggett barked, turning the hairy neck towards me. "It looks as though I'll have to catch 'em all myself." I injected the animal. I was inoculating a batch of 20 with preventive pneumonia vaccine, and Ned was suffering. With his diminutive stature and skinny, small-boned limbs, he had always seemed to me to be in the wrong job. But he had been a farm worker all his life, and he was over 60 now, grizzled, balding and slightly bent, but still battling on. Mr. Daggett reached out, and as one of the shaggy creatures sped past, he scooped the head into one of his great hands and seized the ear with the other. The little animal seemed to realize it was useless to struggle, and stood unresisting as I inserted the needle. At the other end, Ned put his knee against the calf's rear and listlessly pushed it against the wall. He wasn't doing much good, and his boss gave him a withering glance. We finished the bunch with hardly any help from the little man, and as we left the pen and came out into the yard, Mr. Daggett wiped his brow. It was a raw November day, but he was sweating profusely, and for a moment he leant his gaunt 6-foot frame against the wall as the wind from the bare moorland blew over him. "By God, he's a useless little beggar, is that?" he grunted. "I don't know how I put up with him." He muttered to himself for a few moments, then gave tongue again. "Hey, Ned!" The little man, who had been trailing aimlessly over the cobbles, turned his pinched face and looked at him with his submissive but strangely expectant eyes. "Get them bags of corn up into the granary," his boss ordered. Wordlessly, Ned went over to a cart and with an effort shouldered a sack of corn. As he painfully mounted the stone steps to the granary, his frail little legs trembled and bent under the weight. Mr. Daggett shook his head and turned to me. His long, cadaverous face was set in its usual cast of melancholy. "You know what's wrong with Ned?" he murmured confidentially. "What do you mean?" "Well, you know why he can't catch them calves?" My own view was that Ned wasn't big enough or strong enough, and anyway, he was naturally ineffectual. But I shook my head. "No," I said. "Why is it?" "Well, I'll tell you." Mr. Daggett glanced furtively across the yard, then spoke from behind his hand. "He's ower fond at bright lights." "Eh?" "I'm telling you, he's crazed over bright lights." "Bright... what? Where?" Mr. Daggett leant closer. "He gets over to Bristol every night." "Bristol?" I looked across from the isolated farm to the village 3 miles away on the other side of the dale. It was the only settlement in that bleak vista, a straggle of ancient houses dark and silent against the green fellside. I could recall that at night the oil lamps made yellow flickers of light in the windows, but they weren't very bright. "I don't understand." "Well, he gets into pub." "Ah, the pub." Mr. Daggett nodded slowly and portentously, but I was still puzzled. The Hulton Arms was a square kitchen where you could get a glass of beer and where a few old men played dominoes of an evening. It wasn't my idea of a den of vice. "Does he get drunk there?" I asked. Nay, nay," the farmer shook his head. "It's not that. It's the hours he keeps." "Comes back late, eh?" "Aye, that he does." The eyes widened in their cavernous sockets. "Sometimes he doesn't get back till 9:30 or 10 o'clock. "Gosh, is that so?" "Sure as I'm standing here. And there's another thing. He can't get out of his bed next day. I've done half a day's work before he starts." He paused and glanced again across the yard. "You can believe me or believe me not, but sometimes he isn't on the job till 7 o'clock in morning. Good heavens!" He shrugged wearily. "Ah, well, you see how it is. Come into house. You'll want to wash your hands." In the huge flagged kitchen I bent low over the brown earthenware sink. Scar Farm was 400 years old, and the various tenants hadn't altered it much since the days of Henry VIII. Gnarled beams, rough whitewashed walls, and hard wooden chairs. But comfort had never been important to Mr. Daggett or his wife, who was ladling hot water from the primitive boiler by the side of the fire and pouring it into a scrubbing bucket. She clopped around over the flags in her clogs, hair pulled back tightly from her weathered face into a bun, a coarse sacking apron tied round her waist. She had no children, but her life was one of constant activity. Indoors or outside, she worked all the time. At one end of the room, wooden steps led up through a hole in the ceiling to a loft where Ned slept. That had been the little man's room for nearly 50 years, ever since he had come to work for Mr. Daggett's father as a boy from school. And in all that time he had never travelled further than Darrowby, never done anything outside his daily routine. Wifeless, friendless, he plodded through his life endlessly milking, feeding and mucking out, and waiting, I suspected with diminishing hope, for something to happen. With my hand on the car door, I looked back at Scar Farm, at the sagging roof tiles, the great stone lintel over the door. It typified the harshness of the lives of the people within. Little Ned was no bargain as a stockman, and his boss's exasperation was understandable. Mr. Daggett was not a cruel or an unjust man. He and his wife had been hardened and squeezed dry by the pitiless austerity of their existence in this lonely corner of the High Pennines. There was no softness up here, no frills. The stone walls, sparse grass and stunted trees, the narrow road with its smears of cow-muck. Everything was down to fundamentals, and it was a miracle to me that most of the Dalesmen were not like the Daggetts, but cheerful and humorous. But as I drove away, The sombre beauty of the place overwhelmed me. The lowering hillsides burst magically into life as a shaft of sunshine stabbed through the clouds, flooding the bare flanks with warm gold. Suddenly I was aware of the delicate shadings of green, the rich glowing bronze of the dead bracken spilling from the high tops, and the whole peaceful majesty of my workaday world. I hadn't far to drive to my next call, just about a mile, and it was in a vastly different atmosphere. Miss Tremaine, a rich lady from the south, had bought a tumble-down manor house and spent many thousands of pounds in converting it into a luxury home. As my feet crunched on the gravel, I looked up at the large windows, with their leaded panes, at the smooth, freshly pointed stones. Elsie opened the door to me. She was Miss Tremaine's cook, housekeeper, and one of my favourite people. Aged about 50, no more than 5 feet high and as round as a ball, with short, bandy legs sticking out from beneath a tight black dress. "Good morning, Elsie," I said, and she burst into a peal of laughter. This, more than her remarkable physical appearance, was what delighted me. She laughed uproariously at every statement and occurrence. In fact, she laughed at the things she said herself. "Come in, Mr. Herriot," she said. "It's a bit nippy today, but I think it'll get out this afternoon." All the mirth may have seemed somewhat unnecessary, and indeed it made her rather difficult to understand, but the general effect was cheering. She led me into the drawing-room, and her mistress rose with some difficulty from her chair. Miss Tremaine was elderly and half-crippled with arthritis, but bore her affliction without fuss. "Ah, Mr. Herriot," she said, "how good of you to come." She put her head on one side and beamed at me as though I was the most delightful thing she had seen for a long time. She, too, had a bubbling, happy personality, and since she owned 3 dogs, 2 cats, and an elderly donkey, I'd come to know her very well in her 6 months' residence in the Dale. My visit was to dress the donkey's overgrown hoofs, and a pair of clippers and a blacksmith's knife dangled from my right hand. "Oh, put those grisly instruments down over there," she said. "Elsie's bringing some tea. I'm sure you've time for a cup." I sank willingly into one of the brightly covered armchairs, and was looking round the comfortable room when Elsie reappeared, gliding over the carpet as though on wheels. She put the tray on the table by my side. "There's your tea," she said, and went into a paroxysm so hearty that she had to lean on the back of my chair. She had no visible neck, and the laughter caused the fat little body to shake all over. When she had recovered, she rolled back into the kitchen, and I heard her clattering about with pans. Despite her idiosyncrasies, she was a wonderful cook and very efficient in all she did. I spent a pleasant 10 minutes with Miss Tremaine and the tea, then I went outside and attended to the donkey. When I had finished, I made my way round the back of the house, and as I was passing the kitchen, I saw Elsie at the open window. "Many thanks for the tea, Elsie," I said. The little woman gripped the sides of the sink to steady herself. "That's all right. That's quite all right." Wonderingly, I got into the car, and as I drove away, the disturbing thought came to me that one day I might say something really witty to Elsie and cause her to do herself an injury. I was called back to Mr. Daggett's quite soon afterwards to see a cow which wouldn't get up. The farmer thought she was paralysed. I drove there in a thin drizzle, and the light was fading at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon when I arrived at Scar Farm. When I examined the cow, I was convinced she had just got herself into an awkward position in the stall with her legs jammed under the broken timbers of the partition. "I think she's sulking, Mr. Daggett," I said. "She had a few goes at rising, and now she's decided not to try any more. Some cows are like that." "Maybe you're right," the farmer replied. "She's allus been a stupid bitch. And she's a big one, too. She'll take a bit of moving." I lifted a rope from the byre wall and tied it round the hocks. "I'll push the feet from the other side while you and Ned pull the legs round." "Pull?" Mr. Daggett gave the little man a sour look. "He couldn't pull the skin off a rice pudding." Ned said nothing, just gazed dully to his front, arms hanging limp. He looked as though he didn't care, wasn't even there with us. His mind was certainly elsewhere if his thoughts were mirrored in his eyes, vacant, unheeding, but as always, expectant. I went behind the partition and thrust steadily at the feet while the men pulled. At least Mr. Daggett pulled, mouth open, gasping with effort, while Ned leant languidly on the rope. Inch by inch the big animal came round, till she was lying almost in the middle of the stall. But as I was about to call a halt, the rope broke, and Mr. Daggett flew backwards onto the hard cobbles. Ned, of course, did not fall down because he hadn't been trying, and his employer, stretched flat, glared up at him with frustrated rage. "You little bugger, you let me do that all by myself. I don't know why I bother with you, you're bloody useless." At that moment the cow, as I'd expected, rose to her feet, and the farmer gesticulated at the little man. "Well, go on, dang you, get some straw and rub her legs. They'll be numb." Meekly, Ned twisted some straw into a wisp and began to do a bit of massage. Mr. Daggett got up stiffly, felt gingerly along his back, then walked up beside the cow to make sure the chain hadn't tightened around her neck. He was on his way back when the big animal swung round suddenly and brought her cloven hoof down solidly on the farmer's toe. If he had been wearing heavy boots, it wouldn't have been so bad, but his feet were encased in ancient cracked Wellingtons which offered no protection. "Ow! Ow! Ow!" yelled Mr. Daggett, beating on the hairy back with his fists. "Get off, you old bitch!" He heaved, pushed, and writhed, but the 10 hundredweight of beef ground down inexorably. The farmer was only released when the cow slid off his foot, and I know from experience that sliding is the worst part. Mr. Daggett hopped round on one leg, nursing the bruised extremity in his hands. "Bloody hell!" he moaned. "Oh, bloody hell!" Just then I happened to glance towards Ned, and was amazed to see the apathetic little face crinkle suddenly into a wide grin of unholy glee. I couldn't recall him even smiling before, and my astonishment must have shown in my face because his boss whipped round suddenly and stared at him. As if by magic, the sad mask slipped back into place, and he went on with his rubbing. Mr. Daggett hobbled over to the car with me, and as I was about to leave, he nudged me. "Look at him," he whispered. Ned, milk pail in hand, was bustling along the bar with unwonted energy. His employer gave a bitter smile. "It's t'only time he ever hurries. Can't wait to get out to pub." "Oh, well, you say he doesn't get drunk. There can't be any harm in it." The deep, sunk eyes held me. "Don't you believe it. He'll come to a bad end gadding about the way he does. But surely the odd glass of beer, but there's more than that to it." He glanced around him. "There's women." I laughed incredulously. "Oh, come on now, Mr. Daggett. What women?" "Over at pub," he muttered. "Them Bradley lasses." "The landlord's daughters?" "Oh, really, I can't believe—" "All right, you can say what you like. He's got his eye on 'em. I know. I've only been in that pub once, but I've seen for myself." I didn't know what to say, but in any case I had no opportunity because he turned and strode into the house. Alone in the cold darkness, I looked at the gaunt silhouette of the old farmhouse above me. In the dying light of the November day, the rain streamed down the rough stones, and the wind caught at the thin tendril of smoke from the chimney, hurling it in ragged streamers across the slate-blue pallor of the western sky. The fell hung over everything, a black, featureless bulk, oppressive and menacing. Through the kitchen window I could see the oil lamp casting its dim light over the bare table, the cheerless hearth with its tiny flicker of fire. In the shadows at the far end the steps rose into Ned's loft, and I could imagine the little figure clambering up to get changed and escape to Briston. Across the valley, the single street of the village was a broken grey thread in the gloom, but in the cottage windows the lamps winked faintly. These were Ned Finch's bright lights, and I could understand how he felt. After Scar Farm, Briston would be like Monte Carlo. The image stayed in my mind so vividly that after 2 more calls that evening I decided to go a few miles out of my way as I returned homeward. I cut across the dale, and it was about 8:30 when I drove into Briston. It was difficult to find the Hulton Arms, because there was no lighted entrance, no attempt to advertise its presence, but I persevered, because I had to find out what was behind Mr. Daggett's tale of debauchery. I located it at last. just like the door of an ordinary house with a faded wooden sign hanging above it. Inside, the usual domino game was in progress. A few farmers sat chatting quietly. The Mrs. Bradley, plain but pleasant-faced women in their 40s, sat on either side of the fire, and sure enough, there was Ned with a half-pint glass in front of him. I sat down by his side. "Hello, Ned." "Now then, Mr. Herriot," he murmured absently, glancing at me with his strange, expectant eyes. One of the Bradley ladies put down her knitting and came over. "Pint of bitter, please," I said. "What will you have, Ned?" "Nay, thank you, Mr. Herriot. This'll do for me. It's me second, and I'm not a big drinker, thou knows." Miss Bradley laughed. "Yes, he nobbut has his 2 glasses a night, but he enjoys them, don't you, Ned?" "That's right, I do." He looked up at her, and she smiled kindly down at him before going for my beer. He took a sip at his glass. "I really come for the company, Mr. Herriot." "Yes, of course," I said. I knew what he meant. He probably sat on his own most of the time, but around him was warmth and comfort and friendliness. A great log sent flames crackling up to the wide chimney. There was electric light and shining mirrors with whisky slogans painted on their surface. It wasn't anything like Scar Farm. The little man said very little. He spun out his drink for another hour, looking around him as the dominoes clicked, and I lowered another contemplative pint. The Mrs. Bradley knitted and brewed tea in a big black kettle over the fire, and when they had to get up to serve their customers, they occasionally patted Ned playfully on the cheek as they passed. By the time he tipped down the last drop and rose to go, it was 10:15, and he still had to cycle across to the other side of the dale. Another late night for Ned. It was a Tuesday lunchtime in early spring. Helen always cooked steak and kidney pie on Tuesdays, and I used to think about it all morning on my rounds. My thoughts that morning had been particularly evocative because lambing had started, and I had spent most of the time in my shirt-sleeves in the biting wind as my hunger grew and grew. Helen cut into her blissful creation and began to scoop the fragrant contents onto my plate. "I met Miss Tremaine in the marketplace this morning, Jim." "Oh, yes?" I was almost drooling as my wife stopped shoveling out the pie, sliced open some jacket potatoes, and dropped pats of farm butter onto the steaming surfaces. "Yes. She wants you to go out there this afternoon and put some canker drops in Wilberforce's ears, if you have time." "Oh, I have time for that," I said. Wilberforce was Miss Tremaine's ancient tabby, and it was just the kind of job I wanted after my arm-aching morning. I was raising a luscious forkful when Helen spoke again. "Oh, and she had an interesting item of news." "Really?" But I began to chew, and my thoughts were distant. "It's about the little woman who works for her. Elsie? You know her?" I nodded and took another mouthful. Of course, of course." "Well, it's quite unexpected, I suppose, but Elsie's getting married." I choked on my pie. "What?" "It's true. And maybe you know the bridegroom." "Tell me." "Well, he works in one of the neighbouring farms. His name is Ned Finch." This time my breath was cut off completely, and Helen had to beat me on the back as I spluttered and retched. It wasn't until an occluding morsel of potato skin had shot down my nose that I was able to utter a weak croak. "Ned Finch?" "That's what she said." I finished my lunch in a dream, but by the end of it I had accepted the extraordinary fact. Helen and Miss Tremaine were 2 sensible people. There couldn't be any mistake, and yet, even as I drew up outside the old manor house, a feeling of unreality persisted. Elsie opened the door as usual. I looked at her for a moment. "What's this I hear, Elsie?" She started a giggle which rapidly spread over her spherical frame. I put my hand on her shoulder. "Is it true?" The giggle developed into a mighty gale of laughter, and if she hadn't been holding the handle, I'm sure she would have fallen over. "Aye, it's right enough," she gasped. "I've found a man at last, and I'm going to get wed." She leant helplessly on the door. "Well, I'm pleased to hear it, Elsie. I hope you'll be very happy." She hadn't the strength to speak, but merely nodded as she lay against the door. Then she led me to the drawing room. "In you go," she chuckled. "I'll bring you some tea." Miss Tremaine rose to greet me with parted lips and shining eyes. "Oh, Mr. Herriot, have you heard?" "Yes. But how—" "It all started when I asked Mr. Daggett for some fresh eggs. He sent Ned on his bicycle with the eggs, and it was like fate." "Well, how wonderful." "Yes, and I actually saw it happen. Ned walked in that door with his basket. Elsie was clearing the table here, and Mr. Herriot—" She clasped her hands under her chin, smiled ecstatically, and her eyes rolled upwards. "Oh, Mr. Herriot, it was love at first sight." "Yes, yes, indeed. Marvellous." "And ever since that day, Ned has been calling round, and now he comes every evening and sits with Elsie in the kitchen. Isn't it romantic?" "It certainly is. And when did they decide to get married?" "Oh, he popped the question within a month. And I'm so happy for Elsie because Ned is such a dear little man, don't you think so?" "Yes, he is," I said. "He's a very nice chap." Elsie simpered and tittered her way in with the tea, then put her hand over her face and fled in confusion. And as Miss Tremaine began to pour, I sank into one of the armchairs and lifted Wilberforce onto my lap. The big cat purred as I instilled a few drops of lotion into his ear. He had a chronic canker condition, not very bad, but now and then it became painful and needed treatment. It was because Miss Tremaine didn't like putting the lotion in that I was pressed into service. As I turned the ear over and gently massaged the oily liquid into the depths, Wilberforce groaned softly with pleasure and rubbed his cheek against my hand. He loved this anointing of the tender area beyond his reach, and when I'd finished he curled up on my knee. I leant back and sipped my tea. At that moment, with my back and shoulders weary, and my hands red and chapped with countless washings on the open hillsides, this seemed to be veterinary practice at its best. Miss Tremaine continued, "We shall have a little reception after the wedding, and then the happy couple will take up residence here." "You mean in this house?" "Yes, of course. There's heaps of room in this big old place, and I have furnished 2 rooms for them on the east side. I'm sure they'll be very comfortable. Oh, I'm so excited about it all." She refilled my cup. "Before you go, you must let Elsie show you where they're going to live." On my way out, the little woman took me through to the far end of the house. "This," she said, "is where we'll sit of a night, and this, oh dear me, is our bedroom." She staggered around for a bit, wiped her eyes, and turned to me for my opinion. "It's really lovely, Elsie," I said. There were bright carpets, chairs with flowered covers, and a fine mahogany-ended bed. It was nothing like the loft. And as I looked at Elsie, I realized the things Ned would see in his bride. Laughter, warmth, vivacity, and, I had no doubt at all, beauty and glamour. I seemed to get round to most farms that lambing time, and in due course I landed at Mr. Daggett's. I delivered a fine pair of twins for him, but it didn't seem to cheer him at all. Lifting the towel from the grass, he handed it to me. "Well, what did I tell you about Ned, eh? Got mixed up with a woman, just like I said." He sniffed disapprovingly. "All that raking and chasing about. I knew he'd get into mischief at finish." I walked back over the sunlit fields to the farm, and as I passed the byre door, Ned came out pushing a wheelbarrow. "Good morning, Ned," I said. He glanced up at me in his vague way. "How do, Mr. Herriot?" There was something different about him, and it took me a few moments to discern what it was. His eyes had lost that expectant look which had been there for so long, and after all, that was perfectly natural, because it had happened at last for Ned. Chapter 47. I had plenty of time on my hands at Eastchurch, plenty of time to think, and like most servicemen, I thought of home. Only my home wasn't there anymore. When I left Darrowby, Helen had gone back to live with her father, and the little rooms under the tiles of Skeldale House would be empty and dusty now. But they lived on in my mind, clear in every detail. I could see the ivy-fringed window looking over the tumble of roofs to the green hills, our few pieces of furniture, the bed and side table, and the old wardrobe which only stayed shut with the aid of one of my socks jammed in the door. Strangely, it was that dangling woolen toe which gave me the sharpest stab, as I remembered. Even though it was all gone, I could hear the bedside radio playing, my wife's voice from the other side of the fire, and on that winter evening Tristan shouting up the stairs from the passage far below. "Jim! Jim!" I went out and stuck my head over the banisters. "What is it, Tris?" "Sorry to bother you, Jim, but could you come down for a minute?" The upturned face had an anxious look. I went down the long flights of steps 2 at a time, and when I arrived slightly breathless on the ground floor, Tristan beckoned me through to the consulting room at the back of the house. A teenage girl was standing by the table, her hand resting on a stained roll of blanket. "It's a cat," Tristan said. He pulled back a fold of the blanket, and I looked down at a large, deeply striped tabby. At least he would have been large if he had any flesh on his bones, but ribs and pelvis stood out painfully through the fur, and as I passed my hand over the motionless body I could feel only a thin covering of skin. Tristan cleared his throat. "There's something else, Jim." I looked at him curiously. For once he didn't seem to have a joke in him. I watched as he gently lifted one of the cat's hind legs and rolled the abdomen into view. There was a gash on the ventral surface through which a coiled cluster of intestines spilled grotesquely onto the cloth. I was still shocked and staring when the girl spoke. "I saw this cat sitting in the dark, down Brown's yard. I thought he looked skinny-like and a bit quiet, and I bent down to give him a pat. Then I saw he was badly hurt, and I went home for a blanket and brought him round to you." "That was kind of you," I said. "Have you any idea who he belongs to?" The girl shook her head. "No, he looks like a stray to me." "He does indeed." I dragged my eyes away from the terrible wound. "You're Marjorie Simpson, aren't you?" "Yes." "I know your dad well. He's our postman." "That's right." She gave a half smile, then her lips trembled. "Well, I reckon I'd better leave him with you. You'll be going to put him out of his misery. There's nothing anybody can do about that." I shrugged and shook my head. The girl's eyes filled with tears. She stretched out her hand and touched the emaciated animal, then turned and walked quickly to the door. "Thanks again, Marjorie," I called after the retreating back. "And don't worry, we'll look after him." In the silence that followed, Tristan and I looked down at the shattered animal. Under the surgery lamp it was all too easy to see. He had almost been disemboweled, and the pile of intestines was covered in dirt and mud. "What do you think did this?" Tristan said at length. "Has he been run over?" "Maybe," I replied. "Could be anything. An attack by a big dog, or somebody could have kicked him or struck him." All things were possible with cats, because some people seem to regard them as fair game for any cruelty. Tristan nodded. "Anyway, whatever happened, he must have been on the verge of starvation. He's a skeleton. I bet he's wandered miles from home." "Ah, well," I sighed. "There's only one thing to do. Those guts are perforated in several places. It's hopeless." Tristan didn't say anything, but he whistled softly under his breath and drew the tip of his forefinger again and again across the furry cheek. And, unbelievably, from somewhere in the scraggy chest, a gentle purring arose. The young man looked at me round-eyed. "My God, do you hear that?" "Yes. Amazing in that condition. He's a good-natured cat." Tristan, head bowed, continued his stroking. I knew how he felt, because although he preserved a cheerfully hard-boiled attitude to our patients, he couldn't kid me about one thing. He had a soft spot for cats. Even now, when we are both around the 60 mark, he often talks to me over a beer about the cat he had for many years. It is a typical relationship. They tease each other unmercifully, but it is based on real affection. "It's no good, Tris," I said gently. "It's got to be done." I reached for the syringe, but something in me rebelled against plunging a needle into that mutilated body. Instead, I pulled a fold of the blanket over the cat's head. "Pour a little ether onto the cloth," I said. "He'll just sleep away." Wordlessly, Tristan unscrewed the cap of the ether bottle and poised it over the head. Then, from under the shapeless heap of blanket, we heard it again. The deep purring, which increased in volume till it boomed in our ears like a distant motorcycle. Tristan was like a man turned to stone, hand gripping the bottle rigidly, eyes staring down at the mound of cloth from which the purring rose in waves of warm, friendly sound. At last he looked up at me and gulped. "I don't fancy this much, Jim. Can't we do something?" "You mean put that lot back?" "Yes. But the bowels are damaged. They're like a sieve in parts. We could stitch them, couldn't we?" I lifted the blanket and looked again. "Honestly, Tris, I wouldn't know where to start. And the whole thing is filthy." He didn't say anything but continued to look at me steadily. And I didn't need much persuading. I had no more desire to pour ether onto that comradely purring than he had. "Come on, then," I said. "We'll have a go." With the oxygen bubbling and the cat's head in an anaesthetic mask, we washed the whole prolapse with warm saline. We did it again, and again, but it was impossible to remove every fragment of caked dirt. Then we started the painfully slow business of stitching the many holes in the tiny intestines, and here I was glad of Tristan's nimble fingers, which seemed better able to manipulate the small, round-bodied needles than mine. 2 hours and yards of catgut later, we dusted the patched-up peritoneal surface with sulfonamide and pushed the entire mass back into the abdomen. When I had sutured muscle layers and skin, everything looked tidy, but I had a nasty feeling of sweeping undesirable things under the carpet. The extensive damage, all that contamination. Peritonitis was inevitable. "He's alive anyway, Tris," I said as we began to wash the instruments. "We'll put him onto sulfapyridine and keep our fingers crossed." There were still no antibiotics at that time, but the new drug was a big advance. The door opened and Helen came in. "You've been a long time, Jim." She walked over to the table and looked down at the sleeping cat. "What a poor, skinny little thing. He's all bones." "You should have seen him when he came in." Tristan switched off the sterilizer and screwed shut the valve of the anaesthetic machine. "He looks a lot better now." She stroked the little animal for a moment. "Is he badly injured?" "I'm afraid so, Helen," I said. "We've done our best for him, but I honestly don't think he has much chance." "What a shame. And he's pretty, too. 4 white feet and all those unusual colours." With her fingers she traced the faint bands of auburn and copper gold among the grey and black. Tristan laughed. "Yes, I think that chap has a ginger Tom somewhere in his ancestry." Helen smiled too, but absently, and I noticed a broody look about her. She hurried out to the stockroom and returned with an empty box. Yes, she said thoughtfully. "I can make a bed in this box for him. And he'll sleep in our room, Jim." "He will?" "Yes. He must be kept warm, mustn't he?" "Of course." Later, in the darkness of our bedsetter, I looked from my pillow at a cosy scene. Sam in his basket on one side of the flickering fire, and the cat, cushioned and blanketed, in his box on the other. As I floated off into sleep, it was good to know that my patient was so comfortable, but I wondered if he would be alive in the morning. I knew he was alive at 7:30 a.m., because my wife was already up and talking to him. I trailed across the room in my pyjamas, and the cat and I looked at each other. I rubbed him under the chin, and he opened his mouth in a rusty meow. But he didn't try to move. "Helen," I said, "this little thing is tied together inside with catgut. He'll have to live on fluids for a week, and even then he probably won't make it. If he stays up here, you'll be spooning milk into him umpteen times a day." "Okay. Okay." She had that broody look again. It wasn't only milk she spooned into him over the next few days. Beef essence, strained broth, and a succession of sophisticated baby foods found their way down his throat at regular intervals. One lunchtime I found Helen kneeling by the box. "We shall call him Oscar," she said. "You mean we're keeping him?" "Yes. I am fond of cats, but we already had a dog in our cramped quarters, and I could see difficulties. Still, I decided to let it go." "Why Oscar?" "I don't know." Helen tipped a few drops of chop gravy onto the little red tongue and watched intently as he swallowed. "One of the things I like about women is their mystery, the unfathomable part of them, and I didn't press the matter further. But I was pleased at the way things were going. I had been giving the sulfapyridine every 6 hours and taking the temperature night and morning, expecting all the time to encounter the roaring fever, the vomiting and the tense abdomen of peritonitis. But it never happened. It was as though Oscar's animal instinct told him he had to move as little as possible, because he lay absolutely still, day after day, and looked up at us, and purred. His purr became part of our lives, and when he eventually left his bed, sauntered through to our kitchen and began to sample Sam's dinner of meat and biscuit, it was a moment of triumph. And I didn't spoil it by wondering if he was ready for solid food. I felt he knew. From then on, it was sheer joy to watch the furry scarecrow fill out and grow strong, and as he ate, and the flesh spread over his bones, the true beauty of his coat showed in the glossy medley of auburn, black, and gold. We had a handsome cat on our hands. Once Oscar had recovered, Tristan was a regular visitor. He probably felt, and rightly, that he, more than I, had saved Oscar's life in the first place, and he used to play with him for long periods. His favourite ploy was to push his leg round the corner of the table and withdraw it repeatedly just as the cat pawed at it. Oscar was justifiably irritated by this teasing, but showed his character by lying in wait for Tristan one night and biting him smartly in the ankle before he could start his tricks. From my own point of view, Oscar added many things to our menage. Sam was delighted with him, and the two soon became firm friends. Helen adored him, and each evening I thought afresh that a nice cat washing his face by the hearth gave extra comfort to a room. Oscar had been established as one of the family for several weeks when I came in from a late call to find Helen waiting for me with a stricken face. "What's happened?" I asked. "It's Oscar. He's gone." "Gone? What do you mean?" "Oh, Jim, I think he's run away." I stared at her. "He wouldn't do that. He often goes down to the garden at night. Are you sure he isn't there?" "Absolutely. I've searched right into the yard. I even had a walk round the town. And remember," her chin quivered, he ran away from somewhere before." I looked at my watch. 10 o'clock. Yes, that is strange. He shouldn't be out at this time. As I spoke, the front door jangled. I galloped down the stairs, and as I rounded the corner in the passage, I could see Mrs. Heslington, the vicar's wife, through the glass. I threw open the door. She was holding Oscar in her arms. "I believe this is your cat, Mr. Herriot," she said. "It is indeed, Mrs. Heslington. Where did you find him?" She smiled. "Well, it was rather odd. We were having a meeting of the Mothers' Union at the church house, and we noticed the cat sitting there in the room." "Just sitting?" "Yes, as though he were listening to what we were saying, and enjoying it all. It was unusual. When the meeting ended, I thought I'd better bring him along to you." "I'm most grateful, Mrs. Heslington." I snatched Oscar and tucked him under my arm. "My wife is distraught. She thought he was lost." It was a little mystery. Why should he suddenly take off like that? But since he showed no change in his manner over the ensuing week, we put it out of our minds. Then one evening a man brought in a dog for a distemper inoculation and left the front door open. When I went up to our flat, I found that Oscar had disappeared again. This time Helen and I scoured the marketplace and side alleys in vain, and when we returned at 9:30, we were both despondent. It was nearly 11, and we were thinking of bed when the doorbell rang. It was Oscar again, this time resting on the ample stomach of Jack Newbold. Jack was leaning against the doorpost, and the fresh country air drifting in from the dark street was richly intermingled with beer fumes. Jack was a gardener at one of the big houses. He hiccuped gently and gave me a huge, benevolent smile. "Brought your cat, Mr. Herriot." "Gosh, thanks, Jack. I said, scooping up Oscar gratefully. "Where the devil did you find him?" "Well, as a matter of fact, he sort of found me." "What do you mean?" Jack closed his eyes for a few moments before articulating carefully. "This is a big night, thou knows, Mr. Herriot. Darts championship. Lots of lads round at Dog and Gun. Lots and lots of 'em. Big gathering." "But our cat was there?" "Aye, he were there, all right. Sitting among lads. Spent the whole evening with us." "Just sat there, eh?" "That he did." Jack giggled reminiscently. "By Cor, he enjoyed himself. I gave him a drop of best bitter out of my own glass, and once or twice I thought he was going to have a go at chucking a dart. He's some cat." He laughed again. As I bore Oscar upstairs, I was deep in thought. What was going on here? These sudden desertions were upsetting Helen, and I felt they could get on my nerves in time. I didn't have long to wait till the next one. 3 nights later, he was missing again. This time, Helen and I didn't bother to search, we just waited. He was back earlier than usual. I heard the doorbell at 9 o'clock. It was the elderly Miss Simpson peering through the glass. And she wasn't holding Oscar. He was prowling on the mat, waiting to come in. Miss Simpson watched with interest as the cat stalked inside and made for the stairs. "Oh, good. I'm so glad he's come home safely. I knew he was your cat, and I've been intrigued by his behaviour all evening." "Where, may I ask?" "Oh, at the Women's Institute. He came in shortly after we started and stayed till the end." "Really? What exactly was your programme, Miss Simpson?" "Well, there was a bit of committee stuff, then a short talk with lantern slides by Mr. Walters from the water company, and we finished with a cake-making competition." "Yes." "Yes, and what did Oscar do?" She laughed. "Mixed with the company. Apparently enjoyed the slides and showed great interest in the cakes." "I see. And you didn't bring him home?" "No, he made his own way here. As you know, I have to pass your house, and I merely rang your bell to make sure you knew he had arrived." "I'm obliged to you, Miss Simpson. We were a little worried." I mounted the stairs in record time. Helen was sitting with the cat on her knee, and she looked up as I burst in. "I know about Oscar now," I said. "Know what?" "Why he goes out on these nightly outings. He's not running away. He's visiting." "Visiting?" "Yes," I said. "Don't you see? He likes getting around. He loves people, especially in groups, and he's interested in what they do. He's a natural mixer." Helen looked down at the attractive mound of fur curled on her lap. "Of course, that's it. He's a socialite." "Exactly. A high stepper. A cat about town." It all afforded us some innocent laughter, and Oscar sat up and looked at us with evident pleasure, adding his own throbbing purr to the merriment. But for Helen and me, there was a lot of relief behind it. Ever since our cat had started his excursions, there had been the gnawing fear that we would lose him, and now we felt secure. From that night, our delight in him increased. There was endless joy in watching this facet of his character unfolding. He did the social round meticulously, taking in most of the activities of the town. He became a familiar figure at whist drives, jumble sales, school concerts, and scout bazaars. Most of the time he was made welcome, but was twice ejected from meetings of the Rural District Council, who did not seem to relish the idea of a cat sitting in on their deliberations. At first I was apprehensive about his making his way through the streets, but I watched him once or twice, and I saw that he looked both ways before tripping daintily across. Clearly he had excellent traffic sense, and this made me feel that his original injury had not been caused by a car. Taking it all in all, Helen and I felt that it was a kind stroke of fortune which had brought Oscar to us. He was a warm and cherished part of our home life. He added to our happiness. When the blow fell, it was totally unexpected. I was finishing the evening surgery. I looked round the door and saw only a man and 2 little boys. "Next, please," I said. The man stood up. He had no animal with him. He was middle-aged, with the rough, weathered face of a farm worker. He twirled a cloth cap nervously in his hands. "Mr. Herriot?" he said. "Yes, what can I do for you?" He swallowed and looked me straight in the eyes. "I think you've got my cat." "What?" "I lost my cat a bit since." He cleared his throat. "We used to live at Miston, but I got a job as ploughman to Mr. Horn of Wedderley. It was after we moved to Wedderley that Cat went missing. I reckon he was trying to find his way back to his old home." "Wedderley? That's on the other side of Broughton. Over 30 miles away." "I know, but cats is funny things. But what makes you think I've got him?" He twisted the cap around a bit more. "There's a cousin of mine lives in Darrowby, and I heard from him about this cat that goes around at meetings. I had to come. We've been hunting everywhere." "Tell me," I said, "this cat you lost. What did he look like?" "Grey and black and sort of gingery. Right bonny he was, and he was allus going out to gatherings." A cold hand clutched at my heart. "You'd better come upstairs. Bring the boys with you." Helen was putting some coal on the fire of the bed-sitter. "Helen," I said, "this is Mr. I'm sorry, I don't know your name." "Gibbons. Sep Gibbons. They called me Septimus because I was the 7th in family, and it looks like I'm going the same way because I've got 6 already. These are our 2 youngest." The 2 boys, obvious twins of about 8, looked up at us solemnly. I wished my heart would stop hammering. "Mr. Gibbons thinks Oscar is his. He lost his cat some time ago." My wife put down her little shovel. Oh, I see." She stood very still for a moment, then smiled faintly. "Do sit down. Oscar's in the kitchen. I'll bring him through." She went out and reappeared with the cat in her arms. She hadn't got through the door before the little boys gave tongue. "Tiger!" they cried. "Oh, Tiger! Tiger!" The man's face seemed lit from within. He walked quickly across the floor and ran his big, work-roughened hand along the fur. "Hello, old lad," he said, and turned to me with a radiant smile. "It's him, Mr. Herriot. It's him, all right. And don't he look well?" "You call him Tiger, eh?" I said. "Aye," he replied happily. "It's them gingery stripes. The kids called him that. They were broken-hearted when we lost him." As the 2 little boys rolled on the floor, our Oscar rolled with them, pawing playfully, purring with delight. Sep Gibbons sat down again. That's the way he always went on with family. They used to play with him for hours. By God, we didn't miss him. He were a right favourite. I looked at the broken nails on the edge of the cap, at the decent, honest, uncomplicated Yorkshire face, so like the many I'd grown to like and respect. Farm men like him got 30 shillings a week in those days, and it was reflected in the threadbare jacket, the cracked, shiny boots, and the obvious hand-me-downs of the boys. But all 3 were scrubbed and tidy, the man's face like a red beacon, the children's knees gleaming and their hair carefully slicked across their foreheads. They looked like nice people to me. I didn't know what to say. Helen said it for me. "Well, Mr. Gibbons." Her tone had an unnatural brightness. "You'd better take him." The man hesitated. "Now then, are you sure, Mrs. Herriot?" Yes, I'm sure. He was your cat first." "Aye, but some folks would say finders keepers or something like that." "I didn't come here to demand him back or out at swords." "I know you didn't, Mr. Gibbons. But you've had him all those years, and you've searched for him so hard. We couldn't possibly keep him from you." He nodded quickly. "Well, that's right good of you." He paused for a moment, his face serious. Then he stooped and picked Oscar up. "We'll have to be off if we're going to catch the 8 o'clock bus." Helen reached forward, cupped the cat's head in her hands, and looked at him steadily for a few seconds. Then she patted the boys' heads. "You'll take good care of him, won't you?" "Aye, missus, thank you. We will that." The 2 small faces looked up at her and smiled. "I'll see you down the stairs, Mr. Gibbons," I said. On the descent, I tickled the furry cheeks resting on the man's shoulder and heard for the last time the rich purring. On the front doorstep, we shook hands and they set off down the street. As they rounded the corner of Trengate, they stopped and waved. And I waved back at the man, the two children, and the cat's head looking back at me over the shoulder. It was my habit at that time in my life to mount the stairs 2 or 3 at a time, but on this occasion I trailed upwards like an old man, slightly breathless, throat tight, eyes prickling. I cursed myself for a sentimental fool, but as I reached our door I found a flash of consolation. Helen had taken it remarkably well. She had nursed that cat and grown deeply attached to him, and I'd have thought an unforeseen calamity like this would have upset her terribly. But no. She had behaved calmly and rationally. You never knew with women, but I was thankful. It was up to me to do as well. I adjusted my features into the semblance of a cheerful smile and marched into the room. Helen had pulled a chair close to the table and was slumped face down against the wood. One arm cradled her head while the other was stretched out in front of her, as her body shook with an utterly abandoned weeping. I had never seen her like this, and I was appalled. I tried to say something comforting, but nothing stemmed the flow of racking sobs. Feeling helpless and inadequate, I could only sit close to her and stroke the back of her head. Maybe I could have said something if I hadn't felt just about as bad myself. You get over these things in time. After all, we told ourselves, it wasn't as though Oscar had died or got lost again. He had gone to a good family who would look after him. In fact, he had really gone home. And, of course, we still had our much-loved Sam, although he didn't help in the early stages by sniffing disconsolately where Oscar's bed used to lie, then collapsing on the rug with a long, lugubrious sigh. There was one other thing, too. I had a little notion forming in my mind, an idea which I would spring on Helen when the time was right. It was about a month after that shattering night, and we were coming out of the cinema at Broughton at the end of our half-day. I looked at my watch. "Only 8 o'clock," I said. "How about going to see Oscar?" Helen looked at me in surprise. "You mean drive on to Wedderley?" "Yes, it's only about 5 miles. A smile crept slowly across her face. "That would be lovely. But do you think they would mind? The Gibbons? No, I'm sure they wouldn't. Let's go." Wedderley was a big village, and the ploughman's cottage was at the far end, a few yards beyond the Methodist chapel. I pushed open the garden gate and we walked down the path. A busy-looking little woman answered my knock. She was drying her hands on a striped towel. "Mrs. Gibbons?" I said. "Aye, that's me. I'm James Herriot, and this is my wife." Her eyes widened uncomprehendingly. Clearly the name meant nothing to her. "We had your cat for a while," I added. Suddenly she grinned and waved her towel at us. "Oh, aye, I remember now. Sepp told me about you. Come in, come in." The big kitchen living room was a tableau of life with 6 children and 30 shillings a week. Battered furniture, rows of much-mended washing on a pulley, black cooking range, and a general air of chaos. Sepp got up from his place by the fire, put down his newspaper, took off a pair of steel-rimmed spectacles, and shook hands. He waved Helen to a sagging armchair. "Well, it's right nice to see you. I've often spoke of you to Missus." His wife hung up a towel. "Yes, and I'm glad to meet you both. I'll get some tea in a minute." She laughed and dragged a bucket of muddy water into a corner. "I've been washing football jerseys. Them lads just handed them to me tonight, as if I haven't got enough to do." As she ran the water into the kettle, I peeped surreptitiously around me, and I noticed Helen doing the same. But we searched in vain. There was no sign of a cat. Surely he couldn't have run away again. With a growing feeling of dismay, I realized that my little scheme could backfire devastatingly. It wasn't until the tea had been made and poured that I dared to raise the subject. "How," I asked, diffidently, "how is, Tiger?" "Oh, he's grand," the little woman replied briskly. She glanced up at the clock on the mantelpiece. "He should be back any time now. Then you'll be able to see him." As she spoke, Sepp raised a finger. "I think I can hear him now." He walked over and opened the door, and our Oscar strode in with all his old grace and majesty. He took one look at Helen and leapt onto her lap. With a cry of delight, she put down her cup and stroked the beautiful fur as the cat arched himself against her hand, and the familiar purr echoed round the room. "He knows me," she murmured. "He knows me." Sepp nodded and smiled. "He does that. You were good to him. He'll never forget you. And we won't either, will we, Mother?" "No, we won't, Mrs. Herriot," his wife said as she applied butter to a slice of gingerbread. "That was a kind thing you did for us, and I hope you'll come and see us whenever you're near." "Well, thank you," I said. "We'd love to. We're often in Broughton." I went over and tickled Oscar's chin. Then I turned again to Mrs. Gibbons. "By the way, it's after 9 o'clock. Where's he been till now?" She poised her butter knife and looked into space. "Let's see now," she said. "It's Thursday, isn't it? Ah, yes, it's his night for the yoga class." Chapter 48. I knew it was the end of the chapter when I slammed the carriage door behind me and squeezed into a seat between a fat waif and a sleeping corporal. I suppose I was an entirely typical discharged serviceman. They had taken away my blue uniform and fitted me with a D-mob suit, a ghastly garment of stiff brown serge with purple stripes, which made me look like an old-time gangster. But they had allowed me to retain my RAF shirt and tie and the shiny boots, which were like old friends. My few belongings, including Black's veterinary dictionary, lay on the rack above in a small cardboard suitcase of a type very popular among the lower ranks of the services. They were all I possessed, and I could have done with a coat, because it was cold in the train, and a long journey stretched between Eastchurch and Darrowby. It took an age to chug and jolt as far as London. Then there was a lengthy wait before I boarded the train for the north. It was about midnight when we set off, and for 7 hours I sat there in the freezing darkness, feet numb, teeth chattering. The last lap was by bus, and it was the same rattling little vehicle which had carried me to my first job those years ago. The driver was the same, too, and the time between seemed to melt away, as the fells began to rise again from the blue distance in the early light, and I saw the familiar farmhouses, the walls creeping up the grassy slopes, the fringe of trees by the river's edge. It was mid-morning when we rumbled into the marketplace, and I read Darrowby Cooperative Society above the shop on the far side. The sun was high, warming the tiles of the fretted line of roofs with their swelling green background of hills. I got out and the bus went on its way, leaving me standing by my case. It was just the same as before. The sweet air, the silence, and the cobbled square deserted except for the old men sitting around the clock tower. One of them looked up at me. "Now then, Mr. Herriot," he said quietly, as though he had seen me only yesterday. Before me, Trengate curved away till it disappeared round the grocer's shop on the corner. Most of the quiet street with the church at its foot was beyond my view, and it was a long time since I had been down there. But with my eyes closed I could see Skeldale House, with the ivy climbing over the old brick walls to the little rooms under the eaves. That was where I would have to make another start. Where I would find out how much I'd forgotten, whether I was fit to be an animal doctor again. But I wouldn't go along there yet. Not just yet. A lot had happened since that first day when I arrived in Darrowby in search of a job, but it came to me suddenly that my circumstances hadn't changed much. All I had possessed then was an old case and the suit I stood in, and it was about the same now. Except for one great and wonderful thing. I had Helen and Jimmy. That made all the difference. I had no money, not even a house to call my own, but any roof which covered my wife and son was personal and special. Sam would be with them too, waiting for me. They were outside the town, and it was a fair walk from here. But I looked down at the blunt toes of my boots sticking from the purple striped trousers. The RAF hadn't only taught me to fly, they had taught me to march, and a few miles didn't bother me. I took a fresh grip on my cardboard case, turned towards the exit from the square, and set off. Left, right, left, right, left, right, on the road for home.
Thank you for listening to our audiobooks. We do our best to regularly upload quality books with clear narrations. Please subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell icon so we can bring you more great books. Thank you very much, and we hope you enjoyed listening to your audiobook.